Another chapter, another barrel of joy. Maybe. Who knows? Are you enjoying yourself? Well, hopefully you're kind of enjoying yourself and learning something at the same time, that mix between enjoyment and knowledge. It's easier to remember if you're enjoying the experience. If you're not enjoying the experience, then you've come an awfully long way through this course so far. It is a big course. It's a lot to cover, but hopefully it'll be very rewarding. We're now moving on to this next chapter, which is, well, looking at attacks on the castle king, but attacks on the castle king that happen really at long range. So long range attacks. So I've put on the board pieces in green which I'm really saying are the long range pieces: queen, bishop and rook. And it's much easier to use those pieces for a successful attack, as you can do it at distance. You don't have to get right in their face to finish them off. Then short range pieces, which are the pawn, knight, and sometimes I suppose you could say king as well. And we're looking at things in this chapter like back rank ideas, the idea of the escape hole. We're looking at doubling pieces on open files, especially the H file. This is a key idea. You know, typical formations and plans to do with that. Diagonals that we attack the opposing king along. And the strength of two bishops working together. You often hear about the power of the bishop pair. Well, we're going to look at how the bishop pair can function together to launch an attack. So many ideas here, and it's, like I say, all long range ideas against the castled king. Now, a lot of stuff is, to do with how the pieces work together and looking out for weaknesses in your opponent's position. And the first stage we're going to look at here is, one of the most basic ones, I suppose. It can be incredibly complex as well, but the back rank. This is a good one to start with, that long range idea, getting in on the back rank, normally against the castle king. And again, if you're involved, in a battle, it would be a lot less painful if you could throw that arrow, and an arrow is really like your bishops, and get your enemy without going all the way up to him, risking the confrontation before you can cause some damage. Hence why these ideas of long-range attacks are very important, as we will now move on to. So we start by looking at some techniques to do with the weakness of the back rank. And this, I think, can be very simple or very complex. It's something I've taught beginners at school, but it's also something I've fallen into, long combinations to do with the back rank myself. And it's also very common, so it's an important one for us to learn. I mean common in the fact that often both sides will castle in a game of chess, and most often there'll be some tactical ideas based on one side having the three pawns in front of their king there and not being able to escape, not being able to find a way out. So it is really important. And this first example is, I would say, reasonably complex, but also logical one to get us started. It's a game between Najdorf, who I'm sure you've heard about, and Giulio Balbochan. Nice name. And it's played in 1948. And how white does this? It's white to play. You can try to work out the best sequence now if you want to. Is exploiting black's back rank, but he's also combining this with a nice little thing he's got in the position, and that is the passed d-pawn. This is a very important part of this tactic. Two prominent ideas that make it work. Now he first plays rook takes d8, and we're also using pins as well. Now it'd be very embarrassing if black thought he was the one doing the back rank checkmating and now went queen to f1, because after rook takes f1, the rook on f8 is actually pinned. One of those rather confusing positions. So after rook takes d8, black is really forced to take on d8. The other option was queen takes c6, but now we see the power of the d pawn, and white simply takes on f8, pushes d7 and wins. And after rook takes d8, white doesn't go into an ending where black is probably actually drawing there because of the very sort of, well, not much material on the board. You need, in a rook ending, in order to win, more pawns that we have in this position. And he keeps the queens on with queen to b6, hitting the rook. Black now plays a move which I think is most logical, rook to f8, because again you have some ideas of forcing a check here. Now other options are not much better, but they might hold on a little bit. For example, queen c8. Unfortunately, defending in a manner like this is very, very passive. You don't want to defend in such a passive manner. But this is at least holding on for the time being. Now I'm assuming a move like h3 is going to be very difficult for black to hold, just giving your king the escape square. But d7 is much more testing. And the point being, if rook takes d7, we have the check on e6, and we can take with the queen. So the queen has to move somewhere like a8. And actually now we can see we've made a bit more progress. Let's check that king into the corner, and we can force the issue with rook e8, trying to come to the square, and now black is in all sorts of trouble. He has to make his king an escape square, because otherwise it's back rank. If he goes g6, then there's the tactic check and check with rook e8 to follow, winning. And if he plays h6, he weakens another square, and white can sneak his way into that square. And with this rook coming in at the right moment, black will not be able to hold on. A little bit tougher to break down that defense, but as we can see, it's not going to work. The back rank of blacks is weaker. What about rook d7, you might be thinking? Is that possible, trying to stop that pawn going any further? Well, here we can just play queen e3. Threatening checkmate. Remember, if you don't have any good checks or captures, looking for threats is very sensible. And after something like queen f7, holding that square, a nice centralizing move like queen e5 with queen takes b5 to come, leaves white 2 pawns in the good with a winning game. Again, black is just holding on a bit longer in these lines. So rook to f8, very understandable. And now you've got to work out if you can play d7 or not. And I would like to ask you to pause here to consider that option. Well, yes, you can. It might seem like you can't, but again, we have a very sneaky way of coming back. And after rook to f1 check, maybe black got his hopes up for a mere split second, but queen to g1 and it's all over. If the queen is taken, we just take with the king and our pawn promotes. So some nice basic examples of back rank play there to get us into this chapter. And I think certain things to look out for. You've got to make sure your own back rank is covered. And when you're combining ideas on the back rank, as white was here, with a very strong passed pawn, it often becomes too much for your opponent to deal with, as was the case here. This next example, an example of the great Alekhines from 1912 against Kohn, and we actually take it, what I think is from quite a practical position and a position we could learn some lessons from. It's white to play in the following position, and white is a pawn up. Alekhine with the white piece is a pawn up. But there's a threat of black capturing the pawn on e5, and black also playing c5 and capturing the pawn on c2. So it looks like white will lose one of his pawns back. Saying that, when black does capture the pawn on e5, there'll be some back rank problems, and black has this bad knight on h6, so there should be a way we can retain the advantage. One thing about these great players like Alekhine, rather than in this position playing a safe option, and a normal move here would be something like, let's say we defend that pawn, c5, move the knight, and give this pawn back with some hope of an advantage with the rook coming into d7. And this would be a very sensible, normal way to play. But these great players, they really do keep the pressure, and they keep it often in brilliant ways. And they keep the pressure. I mean, it's like one of the biggest skills is to win one positions. I think you'll agree. And positions where you're better. And what I've noticed that the top guys do, they don't shy away from tactics. A lot of references say that you should avoid tactics and complications if you're better. Well, maybe you should, but you shouldn't be scared of them. If you see a way to use tactics to improve your position, even if you're better, you should go for them. And here, the move c4 is played. Now, the point of this is after rook takes e5, it's not some cheapo like knight c6. And I say cheapo, this is one of those moves that maybe a beginner player would play, where you're threatening two things, but you're not looking at your opponent's best defensive move here. And in this position, rook e8. And okay, you might better take the pawn on a7, but your knight is getting sidetracked. Black is getting counterplay with the rook coming to the 7th rank. It's getting messy. And this is a bit of a cheap threat, but the real point behind Alekhine's play is now c5. And this move c5 is stopping the rook from coordinating, and it's causing some problems. If rook takes c5, the tactical idea is, of course, knight to e6 when white is threatening checkmate and the rook, so he will win the rook. So it's a nice little idea, giving up a pawn to get maximum activity and to push black's pieces to uncomfortable squares. Some important things to bear in mind about this is that the rook would love to come back to b8 to cover that weak back rank, but knight c6, tactical idea to stop that. If the rook, maybe it should go to f6. Now, in this position, there are a couple of good moves, but this one, at least black is trying to exchange pieces off. And when you're under pressure, you should aim to do this. The strongest move here being knight to c6. There were other options like knight to f5, but let's stick with the strongest possibility. And this move is now working better because we've sidetracked this rook to the wrong side of the board. So we don't have to worry, as we did before, about these ideas of rook a6. And it works much stronger now. For example, rook to e8 is as good a move as any. And now knight to e7 check. And after king moves, we can just play rook on f to e1 with a great deal of pressure, threatening this check and knight to h7 check, as hopefully you can see. And there's not much that black can do to stop that. These combinations of pieces are putting black under a serious lot of pressure here. I mean, let's say you try moving the bishop. Bishop f5, well, now g4. And a very good way to play against your opponent's bishops is to use your pawns to make them bad. And this move is going to basically run out the bishop. Worth pointing out, in any situation where black tries to take this, it's the back rank again, which is going to be the main problem. Now after c5, black tries rook to a6, and here uncharacteristically Capablanca doesn't find the strongest move. He plays the tempting knight on d to e6, which leads to a small material advantage, but can you improve on Capablanca's play here? There was a better move than this knight jump. Well, in actual fact, knight b5 was better. And the idea is to effectively stop black's rooks getting back to the back rank. And I think this was just not noticed by black in the position. Black has a real problem stopping this rook check, and the knight is also more active on this position. And the good thing about this move compared to knight e6, they're both quite similar, but on b5 it doesn't leave the knight on pre, so effectively that gains white another tempo. Now if you've got the choice between a flash move, knight e6 is flash, and a simple move, obviously go for the best move. Don't get carried away just by the beauty side of it if you just want results. I do that sometimes, it's not good. Go for the simple option, and knight to b5 here is simple and it seems just as effective. Some points behind this. Let's have a look at king h8, which is the move, a similar move played in the game. Well, the difference being after knight to g8, your knight is not attacked now, so you have a chance to play a move such as knight to f7, which doesn't work in the game. And after the rook comes in, black loses the knight on g8 whilst keeping his extra piece. This would have finished the game off quickly. In the game, after the move knight to e6, we have the same kind of sequence, king h8, rook slides in, and now in this position, that same idea does not work as effectively, because if we take on f7 and come in with rook takes, our knight is attacked and can be taken. And after this one, yes, white will come out of it a pawn up, but he could have been a piece and a pawn up. And in actual fact, black has some chances now to activate. Okay, he has to go h6 first, but his rooks are give him some hope of defending here. So a critical chance, a critical position now, and Alekhine decides to simplify when knight takes c7, which I can understand. Going for a simple option where you're going to be better, but there was a move that could be, that the strongest move here is actually rook on f to d1. We want to capture on g8 and come into d8. And this keeps things as actively as can be. And black has to try something like rook takes e6, so he can come to e8. And after knight takes, f takes e6. Now originally this position was considered completely fine for black, but I think the author stopped analysing one move too early, which is easy to do, and after rook to c8 I really don't see any defence for black. There is a dual threat of coming down to d8 and simply taking c7. If we can win the pawn on c7, our c pawn is gonna roll down. So that was another way Alekhine could have played a little bit more accurately. So I did say he kept the pressure on his opponent, but he still misses some opportunities in this game. Let's go on. Knight takes c7, and now rook takes a2. And tactics not really working here. Alekhine now goes rook d1, threatening the same thing. Had he taken on f7, black can answer this by going rook to e2. And there's nothing quite there, and there's a nasty idea of taking here. Who's better now? It's not even clear. So rook fd1 creates the threat there, forces f6, and now after rook g8, Alekhine must have seen that this following position would arise. And he had calculated that after all the fun and games stops, that he has a better position here. Generally, two pieces are better than the rook, but in this case, the c-pawn is really the winning factor. This c-pawn will be slowly pushed down, and you could say here, okay, you know, the game is in the text, and it took white another 20 moves to go, and you know, this is not an easy win, I would like to say, because a rook does increase in value in the ending, and I would not be totally confident about winning this, but it is better for white. Let's go through the moves quickly then, just to see how he does it. Well, first of all, black allows the white king in, and I think black helps white out a little bit. Now, knight on c to d2 was correct here, consolidating. After king e2, a4, this is starting to go wrong for Alekhine. In actual fact, this is a very good move. I mean, the point being, you can't take here because of c6. Sometimes tactics can backfire, but after a4, he risks his way to a win. He should probably now start to think about a draw with something like check and knight takes a4 check. But black is really active here in the center with his king. So I think black will hold this. Also, white's knight being so badly breached. It all started with his king e2 move. Alekhine should have played this knight here when everything is defending each other. And then he can try to push his kingside pawns and get his king to a better square. Some winning chances here. Let's have a look though. After a4, he played the very risky knight on c to d2 and now a3. Who is better? Very risky play. Well, he goes b4 and white's idea is always to have knight c3, but rook c1 stops this. King d3, a2, knight b3, only move, rook d1, and now white is forced to give up one of his knights, leading to the following position. These two pawns should not be enough in a position where the opposing king is so active and with a rook. And after knight c3 check, black now plays a very key mistake. And the reason I wanted to continue with this game, there's a lesson to be learnt here. It doesn't matter who you're playing, you should always, if possible, play the most active move. And if you can move your king forwards here, you should, of course, move it forwards. There's a choice of two ideas. In the game, king c6 led to a slow and nasty advance of the pawns. You allow the white king to get active. Had king c4 been played, this requires some only basic calculation. If anyone, black is a lot better, maybe winning. The only thing you have to calculate is c6. You have to stop that pawn, rook a7, b5. But here, with rook c7, I think it's clear to see that, white has nothing. He can't move the knight, he can't move the pawn, and black is going to distract one of those away with this pawn with great winning chances. The king is active. So it's a lesson there. Always defend, always play in any position as actively as you can. The game, not so good. This stops rook f4. And after b5 check, well, we can see that it's only white who is pushing here. And his gamble did pay off with now one of the pawns promoting. But his opponent helped out there. So a bit of an up and down game there. Some interesting tactical moments in that game. As you can see, a lot of things to think about. Combinations based on the weakness of the back rank are very complex in nature. And the one thing that Alekhine probably did in that game to his detriment, he found a lovely idea, but then he went for the more flashy move rather than the simple move. Simple is always good if you can play it, but we've got a couple more examples of this to show you before we can move on. Now, the success of a back rank tactic is often based on kind of short duration. It's not going to be a long-term idea. It's quite snappy. Your opponent weakens the back rank for a small opportunity, and you've got to dive in when you get the chance. And because of the nature of this, the real intensity, you have to be very careful when calculating, and it can backfire. Watch out for lightning counter strikes, which can, come from your opponent at certain stages. And if your opponent can get rid of the, problem of his back rank in some drastic tactical way, you can turn the position around. So you just be cautious when going into tactics that they don't backfire on you. Be very confident, double check, triple check your calculations. Now, the reason I'm saying that is a game now I'm going to show you between Floor, who's a strong player at the time, and an opponent that he played of no description we know of in a simultaneous in 1933. And black 40 had the better of white after rook takes e5. And And in actual fact, this rook takes e5 move was a very crafty trick on Floor's part, which black fell straight into. Floor now was hit by queen to f2. I say hit, he was fully expecting this one, and queen takes f1. A better way to have played this would have been something along the lines of bishop to e6. I mean, in hindsight, actually, it's probably still pretty grim for black in this position, because white can increase the pressure with something like queen f1, stopping the check and applying that pressure, and after rook on a to e8, h6, just making another weakness of g6, and here this trebling on the open e-file. You can see the pressure building here, and it's very difficult for black to handle this. d4, a useful move, but rook f3, queen d7, and now rook takes f8, king takes f8. Can you see the correct move here? The move that finally puts the nail in the coffin? Well, now bishop to b5. So yes, black is under a lot of pressure after this rook takes e5 move, mainly because of white's idea of trebling on the e-file. So I suppose queen f2 on its own is okay, but combined with the next move, you know, black really accelerates the end of his game here. Black should have been restrained and played a move such as either queen f4 or queen f6. Queen f4 has the advantage of pinning, and queen f6 is a more solid way to try and stop this h6 move and slowly try to develop the pieces. Yes, black is worse, and it's unpleasant to defend because of white's pressure here, but he has some chances. It's his best way to survive. After queen takes f1, can you see the idea that white should have played? He didn't actually play it, funnily enough. It was a simultaneous display, but what should white now play as a little combination? And these kind of tactics, again, why does this one work? Well, it's actually black's back rank. I think the first move is quite obvious. I'll put that on the board for you, check. And it's also because these two guys are not working. Now, first thing to think of here, what happens if queen f7? Well, there's a very nice move if queen f7. Can you see it? Again, pause as you go through. White wins with rook to e7, a lovely tactic. And if queen takes queen, we have this typical checkmate pattern where we use both our rooks on the 7th rank there to create checkmate. And this works when there's a rook on f8. So king to h8 is played, and now what's the best move here? The move that white played was actually intended to be the winning stroke, and it won in the game. But it again can backfire, and when you're entering into these sharp tactical positions, just double, triple check. As this is a simultaneous, we've got to let off, but be aware of outrageous defensive moves that your opponent may have, moves that counter strike. Don't just prepare yourself for moves which you are going to walk into what you want to play. So what should you play here? The move played, rook to f3, looks best, but it's not. In actual fact, if you had played h6, this is a much better move, because you're weakening the black king more. You're not just creating or having these weaknesses on the back rank, you're having weaknesses on the dark squares, those yummy dark squares. Time to dive in on those. And now, if g takes h6, rook to e8 is a beautiful move, combining those two necessarily long-range avenues of attack. Either the queen coming in on the dark squares or coming in on the back rank. If 8 g6, now we could have played rook to this square. As we see, there's a difference in this. In the game, rook to f3 was played straight away. Black now took on f3 without thinking, but after queen takes f3, black now resigned because his queen is attacked and he's getting hit by this. It's There's nothing that can be done in this position after queen takes f3. Can you see the amazing defensive move that black has after this rook f3, which both players missed? Well, black could have now played the intermezzo bishop e6. It has to be a sharp forcing move. It has to be. There's no time to mess about, and this should actually reach some kind of drawn ending. The rooks are now covering. It's just the kind of move to look out for. At least white is not losing, but black has very good drawing chances now. The difference in this position, if you had the pawns here, is let's say white plays rook takes e6 now. Well, black can go rook takes f3, and after queen takes f3, this should be a drawn ending. There's no pawn advantage, still some work to do. If we'd have thrown in h6 first, it's a very useful, what I call flick move to throw in. If you can throw in such a move that just creates weaknesses without really damaging your position at all, you should do. Black has to deal with this because of the threat, and if we do the same thing now with bishop e6, after we capture here, rook takes f3, we have all these ideas on the dart squares, queen e5 being the way to go because we cover f4, and after rook f6, rook takes f6, and this is completely winning. So very subtle little differences there. You have to be aware of them when you're playing. I think this h6 move is the key move that should have been played to make that a very nice little sequence. And often the back rank on its own is not going to be enough. So do look out for other ways to weaken your position, your opponent's position, without causing yourself any serious damage. Now we move on to a bit of a word of warning here. I think one of the first rules I learned was, okay, you castle, you have your three pawns in front of you. Let's take a look at black's position here as the example. And when you're in danger of suffering from some back rank checkmates, just give yourself an escape square, meaning give your king a bit of air. You know, everyone gets a bit cramped, don't they? Especially at the moment when you're in a household. I think the divorce rate must be higher in the times of Corona than at any other time, or it will be afterwards, with people crammed in. You know, you need a bit of air, a bit of escape. But giving yourself that escape square can be very risky. You have to weigh up the pros and cons of it, because moving pawns in front of your king is a very risky operation to do. Pawn moves in chess create weaknesses. It's just a fact. What I mean by that, every time you make a pawn move, you weaken a square. You weaken a square that pawn was defending. When you play pawn moves in front of your king, you make holes around your king. Holes around your king that your opponent might be able to take advantage of. There was a famous case, I remember, of Bobby Fischer, and he lost a game, and he played a move, a pawn move in front of his king, like h6 here. And he spent apparently weeks analysing this h6 move. I think it was against Spassky. And he came to the conclusion it was a losing move. And that one little move in front of his king made his king so much more susceptible to attack. So all I'm saying, it's all good making that escape hole for your king, like playing h6 and g6. Well, it's not all good, but you have to evaluate it very carefully. The solution could actually be worse than the problem. So don't just do it without any thought, be cautious. And a cautionary tale we can see here in this position that was given in The Art of the Attack. And this is, I think, is a very good example of it. To evaluate the position, it's equal on material, but if it's black's move, black is certainly should be doing okay, you would have thought, because black can go h6 and then start hoovering up the pawns, the queenside pawns. The only problem black has, and it is black's move in this position, is his back rank at the moment, meaning that, you know, this queenside play we see with, you know, the rook coming down should be very strong. It should just be a winning idea. You mop up these pawns and you queen your pawns, but you can't do this straight away because of the back rank, of course. So what you do, you need to deal with your back rank as black. Now, I was going to look at this from the black side because it's kind of like, you know, a black point of view what black's first move is, but it is white who ends up winning this. I'm always trying to do in this course the side of the person who gets the tactic, the idea in, but it is in this case black who's on the receiving end, hence why I've picked white. So what should you do? Let you guys, the way you're going to really learn from this course, trying to work out these problems yourself. Should you play h6, g6 or something else before you try taking on a2? Well, h6 was the move that was given as an example, but in actual fact it's a major mistake here, and hopefully you might be able to see why. Every pawn move makes a hold, creates a weakness, and the weakness here is g6. And with a knight coming towards that square in some way, black has to be extremely careful, as we're going to see in the game. Before we look at this, what other options? Well, g6 is no good either. This is another case of the solution being worse than the problem, because now white can get an easy draw. Remember, we're certainly trying to win this with white's pawns being so weak by playing knight to g4. The knight is threatening to come into f6, and this pawn move has created some more weaknesses, f6 and h6. For example, rook a2 is just a blunder because knight f6 and its mate. And if you try to stop that with rook f8, you're clearly going wrong because your rook's moving away. And now after h6, white has created another problem on the back rank. Again, what does black achieve from this? Black can't get active here because this has created a little, the same issue around black's king. If black ever tries to play king g8 in this situation, then rook g7 just forces the king back, and with knight e5 coming, black is losing again. So yet another move that doesn't help black's position, g6. So in this particular case, the escape hole is not working. And the correct move to play here is, first of all, bishop to f8. Not creating any weaknesses by moving your pawns. And now, by not creating weaknesses, black is covering all of these squares. There's not really any back rank problems because the king can safely come here defending. And the main point is this knight has no squares it can come into. It can't come into one of these two squares, g6 or f6, which in the other variations were quite seriously weakened by playing one of the moves. Let's have a look here. Let's say knight g4 is played, just rook takes a2, and here h6 is the best chance, trying to create a weakness. But after king to g8, black very calmly keeps his cool, moves his king towards the center. If white doesn't generate, which white can't, black is going to mop up. And I don't see any way that white can strengthen his attack here. Black is absolutely fine, well, more than fine, winning. Going back to the example given, h6, this kind of like lazy move. You play a move, oh, back rank problem, escape square. Yeah, I'm cool, man. My king can move, man. Not good. Because the knight now comes to g4, and after rook takes a2, knight to e5. And this is a well-known pattern. Rook, knight and pawn with the knight coming in here is very scary. In actual fact, white in this position, it would have been more accurate to have taken immediate control of the back rank with rook d8 check. And after this, only then going knight e5. Because with knight e5 immediately, the example again given in the book, black has the option of now coming back to a8 and defending like that. It's not really what black wants to do because he needs to get these pawns into really winning the position, but it covers the threats. A move such as king g8, which I think is a very human move, you're trying to move the king away for any problems, is now met by rook check, and that king is in serious trouble. If king h7, there's knight g6, a pattern well worth remembering, 3 pieces creating rook h8 checkmate. And if bishop to f8, then knight to g6 is the way that white should play here, and white is going to win that piece and should be better, much better in this position. For example, king f7 forced. Let's take it, move our king to a central square, and these pawns may look scary, maybe b3 being a good try, but white is pretty well positioned to deal with them after knight e7 check. The pieces can get behind them and the knight can come back to defend. I mean, the line given in the book was knight takes c4, and this actually gives away the advantage, because now black could have played in the book a move such as king f7, and his king can still escape with pressure against b2. This should be defendable for black. I mean, black is not better after rook b8, bishop b5, but it's bishop c5, but it's certainly defendable. A normal idea would be b5 here, but it doesn't work here after knight e5, rook takes b2, because now knight to g6 is even stronger, because we've got rid of one of those scary pawns. Both sides not playing as accurately as they could do, and this position, as long as we stop the rook coming to defend the bishop, is winning. So we've got to be careful where we put our king. But after this check, now that we have a pawn defending that square, we can come back to h3. And here, white is easily winning. So again, the lesson to be learnt here is that escape hole. It's a very important concept when your back rank is in trouble to try and create escape hole, but be aware that when you make pawn moves, they can sometimes cause you more issues than if you hadn't made them in the first place. So always be careful with your pawn moves, what squares you're weakening. Sometimes it's necessary, but just be on guard. An interesting topic that is mentioned in The Art of Attack, which I personally haven't heard about before, and certainly this must be the origin, I think, of this theme, is the weakness of the second rank, or the seventh rank, as you may be looking at it from the point of view of the white side here. Now, we have discussed the weakness of the back rank. This rank is often an avenue into attack, but the seventh rank, as Vladimir points out in a very interesting way, is just as weak, because it's not defended by any pieces, and it's normally only got pawns on it, which can be targets. The difference between these two ranks, let's call them the 7th and the 8th in this case, is that it's a lot harder to clear out squares on the 7th rank, because the pawns, or some pawns, will normally stay on that rank, and it's a lot harder to move them out the way, whilst the back rank, the 8th rank, is clear, generally clear in the middle game, or more clear than the 7th rank. So when you're trying to start an attack on the 7th rank, it's often squares that we look for as a way in. I mean, the pawns on the 7th rank can get in the way, but we can look for weak squares to enter into. And this is kind of like the pawns are like, I think Vladimir says this in the book, they're like trees in a forest. They kind of get in the way of the pieces, both sides pieces. But when we're on the attacking side, as we're going to look at here, we're going to be in Rubinstein's position. He's playing against Maroczy in 1920. You can try to make your way into the position by implying pressure on both ranks, but then finding a way in for a useful square on the 7th rank. And, you know, this is an important thing to bear in mind. The weaknesses of both ranks often go hand in hand, and one side can try to get in there, not often with a queen, to use the weaknesses on both ranks to find a way through the position. And let's have a look at that real idea now in practice. So in this position, it's Rubinstein to play, and he plays h5, which is a very logical and normal move, that pawn pushing the knight away. And we saw this as well just recently, that if the pawn gets to h6 in a number of cases, it can cause some major weaknesses in our opponent's position. In actual fact, there was no need for this, and this position was ripe to take advantage of the back rank, and rook d8 was much more to the point here. You can see that black's moved 2 of his pieces off that rank, so we should really be looking for ways in immediately. White has this beautiful control here of the 1 open file. And after something like rook e7, then queen e6 would be breaking through immediately. But okay, this maybe wouldn't have, taken us to the lesson that we're going to see after h5. Now, knight to f8 is played, and now we use that pawn again, h6. And this is trying to clear up some squares, some of those trees, as Vladimir says in The Art of Attack, on that rank. The more of those trees, the pawns he can get out the way, the more likely there is a way in on that diagonal. And this is especially useful here because we have a dark square bishop. And if the g-pawn moves at all, let's say, for example, by taking on h6, our bishop can now come into the game as well. And that's the last piece of white's that we need to enter in the game, and this time with devastating effect. So black is now forced to play knight to g6 to try and stop that bishop coming in. This is black's only hope here. And now we see this infiltration, as I mentioned, with the queen coming in to infiltrate. And we talked about the first 2 ranks, but the next move is similar in thinking. The 6th rank in this position is also using that combination of weaknesses on the back rank and those squares immediately in front of it. In this example, the queen coming in here. And this is a very tricky move to deal with. And obviously black cannot capture because of the back rank, which is clear. So black has to go into defensive mode. And a move such as rook on c to e7, which maybe looks like the most logical in some respects, would be simply met now by h takes g7 check. When black's position falls apart, whatever he takes this pawn with, he's going to be getting into serious problems. So black tries rook to f8, avoiding that dodge of the queen. And now we see this infiltration on the 7th rank, the rank behind the back rank, which is just as weak often, as we said, as the back rank, rook to d7. And of course, a rook on the 7th rank, dating back to the days of Nimzovich, this is where a rook belongs to be. And in this position, it's totally right to start pressurizing black on that rank. The major threat is pawn takes g7, so now black is forced to get rid of the h-pawn. And I love the use of this h-pawn to soften up black's position as well. Lots of different elements in this example. He has to take on h6. And now a lovely tactical idea, combining all of these motifs. And the tactical idea is this bishop h4 idea. The bishop is threatening to come into f6, but the real point behind this is actually the weakness on the 7th rank and those squares, those individual squares that we're looking to get our pieces into, mainly our queen. And in this case, the e7 square is the square in question. We can't move there at the moment because of the knight, so we use a very simple distraction technique. In actual fact, Maroczy resigned here, seeing that knight takes h4 would fall into queen e7 when checkmate is unavoidable. And this was a very methodical combination. It was using many different little ideas, the 8th rank, the 7th rank, the distracting pawn, bringing in the last piece, but combining in a very beautiful way, in a clearing up operation, clearing that 7th rank to move the queen in for devastating effects. And a very nice game to demonstrate how we combine these techniques. And remember, if you get your queen and rook into your opponent's position like this, it can often be deadly. We now jump into a very blunt example of this 7th rank weakness. And here we can see the archetypical positioning, ideal positioning of 2 rooks on the 7th rank. And I'm sure you're aware this is often a deadly combination. Those rooks can just run riot, grabbing stuff around on that rank. And you have to be careful when you move your rooks in like this, because obviously you're exposing yourself. But with our bishop on f8 here, There's no way white can come round the back. And this was a position from Nimzowitsch with the white pieces against Capablanca, and again Capablanca being used as a model game here. Very tricky position to defend. Probably going to be losing because of the activity, even though white's a pawn up. And a little test for you now. Well, in the game, actually Queen b7 was played, but this doesn't help because black clears up. What would you do if white had played rook to f1? And again, this is something we saw in the last game. It was using these combined weaknesses, back rank, 7th rank, with our queen finding a way in, finding a weakness. And what is the move here? Pause if you need to need a bit more time to work this one out. Well, the move here was queen takes e3. And this is breaking through the defences, and we saw this combination actually of the two rooks earlier on in the course. If the queen is taken, it works very effectively when the king doesn't have f1. You can force checkmate by bringing both of the rooks into the position as such. You should also have worked out the best defensive moves for white, and anything else you need to be worried about. Obviously, if we get a chance to go rook takes f2, we're crushing. And even after bishop f4, which might look strong, rook takes f2 leads to the same finish. And again, the queen can't be taken because of checkmate. So we yet again see that combination in a much simpler form there. The rook's creating pressure on the 7th rank and the queen using that to dart into the position on a weakened square. The next example here, taken from the game Floor versus Stoltz, is an example which is really trying to take the viewer, yourself and all of us, away from the usual pattern. And chess, really complex game. We often are not always going to get the same patterns. It has to be slightly adapted. Now in this position, white does have some pressure on the 7th rank, but it's going to be another rank which is the key zone we're going to come into. Maybe you can spot the right move here. It's white to play, and we can break down black's very passive defensive position. Strong bishop, strong queen and rook, but how do we break it down in this position? Well, bishop takes f7 was played by Floor, and this is a nice aggressive way to play, but only combined with the next idea. Now bishop c4, and with ideas of bishop a6 was also strong, but if you can do a crunch move, then do it, because it will win the game quicker and more effectively. The point behind it is that rook a6 comes, and now we're using the 6th rank as the weakness on this horizontal line with the rooks, and this is deadly. And black can't really stop the mating attack now involved with queen g6. If he tries to defend that one in the only way possible, then we switch around to our typical 7th rank idea, and rook f6 will lead to mate very quickly. And the only other move here, bishop b6, then the game continuation, is actually weaker than the text, because after we take on b6, this ending is very easily winning. We can just take the pawn here and take the pawn here. So the best chance black had was bishop d6, and now we can even keep the queens on though, with queen d5 check and rook takes d6. We've destroyed black's position, our pieces remain active, and black has no chance of a defense. Queen e8, rook e6 now clever, just grabbing another pawn. And here black tried rook takes c5, but white has the check now on the weakened 7th rank, either capturing the queen or coming to e7 with the rook. And this shows a winning idea. So remember, don't always get stuck in your ways. Some ranks will become weak all of a sudden. You've just got to be aware of them. In this case, it was actually the focal point g7, which was the main weakness and the main point of attack that white had. So concentrating on these factors of long-range pieces and how they can attack the castle king, we've looked at some, not basic, but sort of general ideas, back rank, the one in front of the back rank. And we're going to look at some whole games now to see the build-up of these ideas in action, but concentrating on specific parts. Now, this is really now moving on to a slightly different part of this, which is the role of the files on the attack on the castle king. Now, files can generally be defined as, vertical files. That's a file, the ones that are going up and down. Ranks are one that are going sideways, and so far we've really only looked at ranks, and we've only looked at the back rank and the 7th rank. Now, in actual fact, it's much easier and much more likely that one side is going to win a game by attacking on an open file. Why is that? Because naturally, the way the game develops, your rooks will get hold of an open file or something similar much quicker, because when a pawn's exchanged, in the exchange French, let's even say, I'll just put that on the board here, you have an open file. So a rook on that file is a good start. And there's a couple of ways a rook, I say a rook, it can be a queen as well, but generally it's an attack on one of those files can work. And that's what we're moving on to now. And I say that, as pointed out in the book, The Art of the Attack, there are 4 main ways of establishing attack on an open file, as we saw, or a half open file. A half open file is when, let's say, a pawn on one side is being exchanged, but we're looking at an opponent's pawn. So I'll just put a pawn structure on the board, if I can work out how to do this. And here you have 2 half open files. White has this one down here. It's not fully open because there's a pawn on d7, but white can still put pressure on that file. And that's a positional aim he should be going for. And black has the C file to put pressure on. And you often see this in Sicilians. So the 4 things I was talking about is when a file is already open from one end to the other, and that allows one side to normally bring their rook directly into their opponent's position to attack. You can also have it where a rook is posted in front of a pawn. So, you see the rook swinger in some openings. So let me just show a technique that I've used to win many games. And it normally occurs in the following variation. And again, we're talking often about middle game variations here. And I've used in this kind of position what I call the rook swinger. And here we post the rook in front of one of our own pawns to start an attack against the castle king. So this is the second way. It's not totally open. We have to move the rook around to get it into a position of attack. And that can be another good technique. And the third option is using a pawn, and this is normally the H pawn in my experience, which is in front of the pawn, and trying to sacrifice that pawn to then open up the rook behind it. And I'm sure you're aware of these kind of ideas where you push Harry quite quickly. And this has even been played in this position, hoping that later on the sacrifice of that pawn will lead to an attack against White's king. Obviously, I'm giving very drastic examples of this at the moment. And the 4th example that's given in The Art of the Attack is the pawn in front of the rook leaves the file by making a capture. So again, if we use this kind of ridiculous example here, if White plays bishop to g2, you take here, it's left that file, let's say White recaptures here, and you try to later on checkmate your opponent on this open line. So they're the 4 general rules. Now, I don't think you have to remember all those individually, but we are going to now go into investigating those individual things in real examples, just to show you how they can work in high-level games. The first game, 1927, we have Yona as White versus the great Rubinstein, 1922, as I said. And we'll go through the moves reasonably quickly to get to the critical position. We now have a6 being played here. Modern theory doesn't actually rate this move in this position But saying that, also a6 has made a bit of a resurgence. Magnus Carlsen has used some similar idea, and the point of this is to try and take on c4 and go b5. The downside is that after white captures on d5, you have to ask the relevance of this move. Both sides now going to a development stage of the game and playing in standard fashion, with now c6 being played. Black's lost this tempo with this move, but it's not so important. And now white plays bishop takes f6. Now, whenever you play an opening, this is so important in general. I say this to anyone who wants advice. You should know the plans you're trying to do in the middle game. And you base your plans around two things: the pawn structure and the pieces. Pawn structure, skeleton; pieces are the organs. The pawn structure will sort of dictate how what your plans are based on, and the pieces can make that work as well. And with this pawn structure, the main idea is the minority attack for white. At some point, preparing to move b4, b5, white tries to use his minority of pawns, 3 versus 4, I should say, to create a weakness in black's position, often on c6 or on d5. There's been a lot written about this. This is the normal way to play in this position. So, something like rook b1, and white will play b4, a4, and b5. When white gets that situation, black will either take on b5 at some point with the c pawn, and this is all the strategy you need to be thinking of from move 1. And when he does take with the c pawn, he leaves the d pawn, and this is what it all boils down to, exposed, because it's no longer defended by another pawn and it becomes a target. On the other hand, after white plays b5, if white is able to take on c6, black can take back with a pawn, looking after the d pawn, but then the c pawn becomes weak because there's no longer a b pawn to defend it, and white can attack that c pawn. So these are the strategies. But in this position, Yona, who is I think described as has an incisive style, decides to take on f6 straight away. I've seen Karpov use this similar technique, but he kind of, I feel, mixes up plans here. There's no real need to do this, and it's a very aggressive idea. The point being, after bishop takes queen c2, he now creates this attack on h7, gains tempo, and he's just going for queenside castling. So certainly a fun way to play. Now already here, black has an option between g6 and h6. I would say one of those moves is actually a weakness and a mistake. The move Rubinstein, being one of the world's best players, plays clearly the best move, h6. Now g6 will lead us into the same sort of theme we discussed, where white is now able to use what I called strategy 3, pushing a pawn in front of the rook to open up lines. And you can do that by h4, h5, opening up that line. And you can see then he's getting this idea to attack on the file because he has a target g6 to open up on. Now, h6 is correct, and white here simply castles. And now this allows black the opportunity to divert white's g-pawn away from the g-file. And this was very interesting. When I looked at this game, without the annotation, I wouldn't have got the point that the author of the Art of Attack was trying to get across, and that was that in order to create an opening attacking front here, white needs to base his play on a pawn break. Pawn breaks are often the start of combinations and attacking play. The only pawn break white really has is at some point playing g5, because this h6 move, you could say, is a weakness. We talked about this earlier. Moving pawns in front of your king makes weaknesses. And in this case, ideally, white would like to play g4 and later on g5, opening up that file in some drastic way, but also getting rid of one of the pawns around black's king. Now, after castling, Vladimir gives bishop g4 an exclamation mark. And after h3, bishop takes g3, g takes f3. This is a very interesting situation. Because to the untrained eye, it may look like, oh, hang on a minute, white's got a g-file. Hey, come on, boys, in we go, checkmate on a g-file. But in actual fact, it's very hard to checkmate because the g7 square is excellently defended. White kind of needs that dark square bishop to try and get rid of the defender or attack h6 here. And this is going to be a much less successful attack now that white can't play g5 because this pawn has been distracted. So it's very interesting, I thought, this little moment in the position. And in actual fact, it was earlier on the h6 pawn which was the weakness in black's position, and now, not in this position, the g7 pawn. White can't really break through there unless black does something sloppy. Now, saying that, in this position, black now falls asleep a little bit. It's clearly time to do something on the queen side. You've got to start your own attack. And I would be trying to not just use my bishop as a great defensive piece, but opening it up here. And again, the author does state that the best move here is not the slow a5 that was played. We have gained time. We've gained time because white's going to need 1, 2, 3, and get the queen over there. Loads of moves to get any pressure. So we got time, but we can't fall asleep. And we also have to watch out for this move. But a5 doesn't really do a great deal, I would say here. Much more to the point would have been b6. When we are trying to go c5 and directly open up white's king. For example, knight e2 is given, trying to bring that knight around, maybe looking for h5. And now just c5. One of the points of this move is if white decides to capture on c5, we don't even need to recapture. Let's develop knight c6. The initiative is the main thing. We don't want to let the white knight come to d4. We're not worried to give up a pawn. Look how our bishop is a great piece. We've got to use these pawn breaks to open up lines, avenues of attack. And this would lead to, I think, a great initiative in this position. So going back to the game, a5 a mistake. And now king to b1 was played. And here, knight d7, knight e2. This is a clever plan. The knight wants to come over to attack. Queen b6, and it's not really clear what black's doing unless he's trying to get c5 in. So he's misplayed it. Bishop f5, just annoying the knight. Rook d8, and now another mistake from white. So these mistakes are quite subtle, but they're very telling. I think the best continuation here is to continue with knight f4 and trying to maneuver this knight around to take f6. Well, there was another interesting idea, but I would be wanting to get rid of this key defender of the black king side. The other move that white could have tried is actually e4 here, and this is another proactive, good, aggressive move. Trying to bring in the pawn in the attack. And probably the best line here is not to take on e4, which unfortunately opens up lines and allows these pawns a bit more flexibility, but to continue with some ideas on the king side. And I think a4, with some potential of moving the rook to b5, is one crafty idea of black's. And there is an interesting line here which goes e5, and now even knight takes e5, with bishop takes e5 to follow. Yes, you've sacked 2 pawns, but with the rook coming around here, you've gained the initiative, you've defended nicely, and your bishop is worth that little material deficit. White takes on d7, and this definitely makes black's task easier after rook takes d7. Now knight to f4 is played, and here rook to d6, just to shore up the position. Rook to g1, white tries to get some play over here. King to h8, very wisely stepping out the way. Rook g4, rook g8, super safe play from Rubinstein here. He's lost this very important tempo with this, so he's lost any advantage around here. Rook to g1, queen c7, and now a very good move from white. How does white break through in this position? Well, it kind of would seem that knight to h5 is logical, but there's no real way to improve the position because you're not threatening to take here. And if you take on f6, we just take back. And in this position, black could continue with b6. And with c5 coming, I'm not sure what white's doing here. White's kind of got all these scary looking pieces, but again, they're kind of artificial. And it's all fair and good putting your pieces on the squares that look good, but they've got to have some real purpose, and I don't see the purpose here. And black with c5 is getting counterplay. So white plays knight d3, and this has much more point because the knight on e5 will have some direct ideas to break open the king, and it blunts out the bishop. So this is a much more purposeful move. Black plays b6 at last. f4, and now brilliantly c5. Black, I think more than desperation, is in a position where he has to do something, and often you'll find this. Often I find I take many more risks in a game of chess when things are going wrong. I'm being outplayed. Oh, my position's getting worse. I can't just sit there. I need to find a way to liberate my position. I wish I did this all the time. But here, if black doesn't play c5, white has the knight coming in, the queen coming to f5, and this knight is much better placed on e5. There'd be some tactical ideas for sure there. So after f4, c5 is kind of forced. You have to create counterplay, and now white goes wrong. Now, white gets a little bit greedy in this position, and he captures on c5. Now, this is certainly wrong to get greedy at this position because all of a sudden, the bishop is open. Had white just continued with his plan of knight e5, you could say this is approximately equal. Maybe now black has to try a pawn storm with something along the lines of c4. But now queen a4 holds up that idea, with the idea of blockading with the queen. Not normally a good idea, but in this position, a perfectly adequate idea. Black can now try a pawn sacrifice, and then it's probably right to get rid of this one and queen b6. But after something like this, white has some chances to hold on. I still like actually black's position here. Black's found a way to break through. The key move there being this b5 move. Maybe this queen should not be coming out here. The other way I suppose white could have played is to try and go into defensive measures. Sometimes you have to do this, and rook c1 could have been the other way. But let's continue with the game. White takes on c5. Black recaptures. Queen takes c5, but now we see the first instant that I mentioned before the game, and that is the whole open file. Starting an attack on a clear open file. And this is now what black does with rook c6. The queen comes back to a3. If it takes another pawn, then rook d8 is crushing with the idea queen e4, queen b7. Dual threat of rook takes d3 and queen there checkmate, plus queen rook to c1 discovered, winning the queen. So queen a3 is played, and now rook c8. And this is the typical domination of an open file. One little thing I found in my own games actually is that I often didn't respect the open file enough. And I let my opponent get control of it. Maybe if it's the structural things, but it's a really big thing to concern yourself with. You can get the open file, dominate it. You're on your way to winning. Rook d1 played, and now a lovely tactic. Bishop takes b2, straight in there, finding a point and breaking it. Knight takes b2 would allow rook c1 back rank, and we're combining those techniques we saw in the last game. Queen takes b2 allows rook b6, winning the queen. So king takes b2 is forced, and now a very nice touch, rook to c3, finding entrance points. And this all works because of the power of this file. The main idea of this move is to make the queen abandon the c3 square so that the queen will have access. So after queen a4, rook c2. There are other ways that Well, I mean, okay, in this position, it's time here, really, because the queen is coming in. I mean, rook c2 is clearly the best way, combining those second rank, first rank attacks. And what can be played here? Well, okay, white resigned. He can't find a safe square for his king. King a3, queen d6 check is going to win with the rook coming in. King b1 here allows rook b8 check with the queen coming in. And king a1 allows queen c3 check. It's actually clear that this rook c2 is just crushing. So we saw various sort of ideas of open files and attacking play being used in that. Now, bishop g4 and taking was a very impressive idea. You're giving yourself the open file, but realizing it's not significant. But that doesn't mean you can relax. And black's a5 move relaxed a little bit too soon. But the real mistake from white came with him grabbing this pawn on c5. Yes, he wins a pawn, but he gives black total domination of the c-file and this diagonal. And those factors led to a very impressive win by Rubinstein. Now, probably the most standard attack on an open file, well, one that I know of, is an open H file, and we will come to that. But another way you can use the, shall we say, vertical line, the file to attack on, is the rook swing, and by bringing your rook in front of a pawn, which I demonstrated very briefly a couple of moves ago. And a nice example that is used in The Art of the Attack is this game, Rold versus Samish 1931. And if you look at the following position, you can see that white has this half open file here. Let's evaluate quickly. We don't need to spend long. He has this bishop. Remember, that bishop has the Greek gift possibilities. He has another bishop which will swap off one of the only defenders of black's position. But there's another factor here, and it's this rook on d3, which has the swinging potential to come over to h3. And this is often a very powerful attacking idea, as we're going to see used by Rold in this game here. It's white to play and white to start a devastating attack. This has some similarity to the Greek gift or the classical bishop sacrifice, but it's a little bit different because it involves the rook swinging immediately. So here we have, pause if you want to do your own calculations, bishop takes h7. And this works now in combination with the rook swinging and the queen doubling. So you're clearing up the file so your queen can try to land on h8. A very standard idea. I will give you, after I've shown this game and a bit later on, some examples. I'll try to find some examples. You can try to think yourself. I can think this idea works in many openings. Even the Dutch, the birds, lots of things. And this is I would say, well, you could say it's described in the book as a semi-classic. This draws the king out to this square where we can gain a tempo. And it's a clearance move. It's clearing that pawn. Black really has to take, and now we continue with the check. You can't come to g6 because of mate. You have to go back. And now we need to allow our queen to arrive on h4. So we have to get rid of that defender. So we now eliminate the remaining defender. Black tries to bring his knight over to defend, but queen h4 is pretty scary to say the least. White has this queen h1 idea, and this is a typical use of the rook swinger or placing the rook in front of a pawn, combined with a little sacrifice there. The game does go on a little bit. It goes queen c5. If we move our king, we drop a pawn with check. So rook f2 is best. And the only way to stop checkmate immediately is to play knight h5. Other moves don't work. And now the f pawn can move. But this is not going to help too greatly. Queen takes h5, f6, and now g5. Trying to come to g6. And also, in some positions, just opening it up. So queen takes d5, played by black. And now the finish is quite nice. Check on h7 we're using this rank now so that the rook can come into f6 with check, and black resigns here in what is a clearly losing position. All of white's pieces are working fantastically well. So that's a nice crisp example of a rook in front of the pawn on what we could call a half open file, but only a half open file in this case when we clear it by a piece sacrifice. Now, one of the most standard forms of attack on an open file is the H or A file slaughter. That's not in the words of the author, though. That's in my own words. And this next example is the first example of 4, where we're going to look at the doubling of heavy duty pieces on the open H file. In this case, the rook is on H5 and another one is coming over. This is a tremendous way to win games. It happens in numerous examples and actually quite a lot of different openings. Sicilian Dragon, Bobby Fischer won with white by playing open the H file, coming down the H file. And this is often why I've used my H pawn very early on in games to try and get rid of it, to use the H file. So a lot of my attacking formations are based on what you're going to see here. And it's very scary. I've lost a lot of games like this as well. Now, in this position here, which was given by the author, it's clear that black has a good attack. Black has sacrificed a queen. Now, when going into such positions, one thing to be very aware of is the escape square that your opponent may have, or an escape square that he might be able to create. And you've got to work around this by either two ways. Getting rid of that escape square, so not allowing him to use a possible route, or by forcing him out onto that escape square and then getting him on that square. So in this case, we can see that white, really his only way is to try and come to f2 after the doubling. So before we play rook h8, we must work out a good way to deal with that idea. Remember, we are a queen down here, and this involves calculation. So I would suggest you now that you actually try to work this one out by pausing and try to find a forcing way which is including white's best defensive moves. So do pause the video and have a crack at this one yourselves now. Well, you can indeed play rook on a to h8. It's actually one of 4 winning ways that the author gives, but like I mentioned before, if you can find one win and you've double, triple calculated it, you don't need to find the other ones. You're just getting greedy. You know, one win's enough. How many times do you want to checkmate your opponent? You don't want to make him cry by, checkmate. Checkmate. One's enough. One's enough. Now, the only response after this move for white is f4. f3 is simply wrong because g3, and there's no response to rook h1. And g3 doesn't help because we have a typical attacking formation with both rooks coming in and the white king is suffocated. So f4 is forced, and now the best move here, and this is a move I hope you got, is rook to h1 check with a very forcing combination. And the whole thing with this course is you're going to have to calculate to become the attacker you want to be. If you wanted to play g3 in that position, you are not looking at your opponent's best defensive moves, and he can now give up his queen, but he staves off the attack. And even though this might still be good for black, it's a bit unclear. White has the knight coming to c3, your material down here, so maybe it's not good. It's unclear. You should always look for the most forcing move first, and in this position it is check. The king comes out, and now the next most forcing move is to bring another piece in, reinforcements. This is the most forcing move because white's only got one reply, which is king to e1. If you haven't calculated the checkmate now, then have another go. It's very pretty, and I think that's one reason the artistic side, this book has the learning side, but another reason it's really acclaimed as one of the best books out there is because of the author's brilliant eye for detail and creating some magical examples, and this is one of them here. Remember, forcing moves, if you can do it like that, then do it like that. Well, rook to f1 check, forcing king to f1. Of course, the second rook dives in when bishop to g1 is forced. And now what's the most forcing move here? It is, of course, rook takes g1. This is working because of the discovered. And remember the golden rule I've mentioned earlier, 3 attacking pieces is often enough to create checkmate. And here, knight to f3 is the way. And next move, our knight is going to g3 wherever white tries to escape with the king. For example, king f1, knight g3. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, sir. So a nice example there from the author of a way of bashing through along the h-file, and I'm sure you'll have some victories like this if you pick the right openings. Everyone who's a chess player does at some point in their chess career. Well, I was going to leave it there, but sometimes we just got to go through everything, don't we? And okay, we demonstrated one win there the very forcing way, but I thought let's give the author the dues he is deserved and show all the checkmates. And in this position, rather than going rook to h8, I want you to try to find another way to force the win here. And this one is to do with actually the idea of a piece clearance move and trying to, well, find another way of doing it. But maybe let's give you the first move. I'm going to give you the first move, a little training exercise. The first move is knight e2. And this is the piece clearance move. And after queen takes e2, it's now your job to find this secondary win. Again, in a game situation, you wouldn't need to do this, but let's just have a look because it is a beautiful position and it's so rich. I thought we should look at the other ways you can do it. So try to find the secondary winning idea from the original position. I've given you the first move. Try to force it now all the way to checkmate. It's a little combination. Test yourself. Pause now. Well, here the way to do it is to start with rook h8. Again, f4 is the only move. We continue with g3. White has to eliminate our rook. And now the point behind this, bishop takes e3. We weren't able to do this before because there's a piece in a way. Sometimes we need to do a piece clearance sacrifice. Rook to f2. There's an interesting quote here that Vladimir gives, and it's the quote that some players, I'll try to do it in my Russian accent, this is going to be terrible. Some players are more hurt by forced moves of this kind than by checkmate itself. Okay, I won't try that again. It's a horrible accent, but I apologise to anyone with Russian, who's Russian or anything to do with Russia out there. I need to come over and get some lessons off you. But here, this is a painful move to make, isn't it? I mean, you realise you're totally tied up. You're pretty defenceless, and you really can't do much here. Now, the best way to play this is actually by playing knight takes h5, because the knight wants the g3 square after pawn takes. The immediate threat, pawn takes f2, knight g3. I think if you saw this move, you basically solved the puzzle. King to f1, trying to run away, but we do threaten mate now. And here, if the king tries to run some more, the quickest way of actually doing this is by playing f1 queen. We now use the back rank with the rook finally jumping into h1 with mate. So a very rich example, this one given, and we'll show the other two ways as well. If you're very clever, you might have worked them out by now. But should I now do another Russian accent, or I don't know? I think that's enough. I think that's enough for now. Well, yet another way we can checkmate from the starting position, and it all involves this h-file. Like before, we go knight e2 to open up our bishop. I'm hoping some of you spotted this checkmate in the last video and you were trying to solve things yourself rather than you know, waiting until I give you the go ahead and take you through it. And after f4, there is indeed another way of doing this. We just looked at pushing on with g3, and the other way we can do this is the same principle, taking the f2 square away from white. Remember, when you're trying to force any checkmate, especially on a file, you have to look for the escape squares your opponent can use. And how can we do that now? You've got to be a little bit careful, because let's remember this is check as well. So have a little think. What else can we do? As well as playing g3, g3 worked very nicely because of our bishop takes e3 intermezzo, but there's another way. Pause. Well, we can even play bishop takes e3 check, when this has to be taken because of the rook coming to h1. And now a very nice tactic, knight takes e4. And had you seen this move, I'm sure you could have solved it. This takes away the f2 square, and well, we also have g3. The big threat is rook h1 as always, and after queen takes e4, we can just play g3. The distraction idea of moving the knight in so the queen can no longer come to the square. There's a couple of checks that white can throw in here, but white is in a totally helpless situation and will lose the rook on e1. And this is with some check along here. You can look at that, but that's the basic pattern. We've got one more in the same position, and then we will move on, I promise. And finally, we come to the most subtle and I think hardest solution to this position. We've looked at 3 different ways of doing it, and I think the other 3 are much more logical because you're trying to force the position. If you can force the win, you should force the win. But in this case, we're looking at the very... Can you see the move? Can you even think about it? What is it? There's another way, and it's another move from the original position. The very subtle move, rook h7. I mean, I don't think anyone would play this in a real game, but the point of this is to stop any queen takes h5 sacrifices. So when white tries to make an escape square with this f4 move, we can simply play g3. And white can't get rid of our rook. Our rook, in actual fact, is stronger than the white queen in these positions. And this is a really subtle and somewhat poetic way of winning. Let's have a look at some possibilities here. Well, f4 is key. We'll come to that in a minute. I mean, there is one way, actually, where white doesn't get checkmated, and that is with bishop takes d4. But first of all, g3 does not work here because of knight to f3, and this is an entertaining variation. Queen takes, pawn takes here. White has to try and blockade the h-file, it's his only chance, so bishop g5. But now knight takes e4, bishop to h4, and what is the key move here? Can you see it? We're breaking through in an aggressive way, and of course you should be looking for the forcing options here. Knight takes g3. Threatening knight e2, rook takes h4, and after bishop takes g3, rook h8, clearing the h-file and mating on h1. Now, I did say f4 was critical, but the best defense, and the one which kind of saves it, so it doesn't lead to forced mate, but you know, this wasn't given in the original manuscript, was bishop takes d4. And the point behind this is that king is trying to slip away via f1 and e2. Now the knight's been moved out the way. Our best try is rook to h8, but now white has the very clever move and the only move, which is queen takes g4 check. If we take that one, we're going to lose our rook, and we could be worse there, so we should try king h7. And after queen h3, taking on h3, taking on d4. And this position is absolutely fine for white. So, okay, so this rook h7 would be a little bit stupid, but I think it's nice to include for the subtlety of the idea. And this is, to think of such a move, you really have to get into your opponent's mind. Now f4 is a likely move here, but now we can go g3. The threat is simple. If queen e1, we have the intermezzo knight to e2 check, diverting the queen away. And after this one, we simply go rook to h8. So rook to f3 played, and now rook to this square, and you can see it will be checkmate with the knight coming into e4. So that's our last example from this position, and some crazy and interesting variations there, demonstrating the power of the open file against the opposing king if you can get your rooks there. And in the next example, we're actually going to see some of these ideas taking place in a real game. A segment from a real game now, a game played in 1934, and this game was played between Krogis and Niemöller. I'm sorry about my pronunciations. I'm sure they're not as good as they should be. Apologies. I wish I could just pronounce names better. One of my weaknesses. And we're now looking at this from the white side, the attacker's side. And there's a couple of things we need to bear in mind when we're attacking and trying to get our rooks onto an attacking file. So whether it be an open file or half open file against our opponent's position. So for example, if we take this position here, it's clear to see there is a very juicy H file for white to attack along, for him to start an attack along there. But in order for an attack to be successful, there are a couple of conditions, quite obvious ones to be honest, that you need to think about in order to make this attack stronger. One of them is not really having any pieces on the first rank in the way that get in the way of that coordination. So here we can see that the problem piece at the moment is the king. The king on e1 is in the way at the moment of potentially, a queen or a rook coming behind that one. Other things to bear in mind, like we saw in the last example, are escape squares that our opponent has. We need to try and, when we're doing the attack, consider all escape squares and make sure we're covering them as much as we can. Now this is, I think, quite a straightforward example of the attack, and black has just played the move c4. Position was very bad anyway because black was lacking any counterplay. This pawn structure here is very pleasant. One reason it's so strong is that if black tries to play f6 or f5, make an escape square for the king, then obviously our pawns totally control that, so we can just stop that idea and capture on passant or capture on f6. So what should white play in this position? And again, like numerous examples throughout this course, it really, a lot of the attacks come down to timing. Timing as in, if you don't take your opportunity, you're going to slip into a worse position. You need to grasp the opportunity while it's there. So that's why we need to be on the outlook, the search for the most active move always. So pause again if you need to. Well, I hope you evaluated the position, and by evaluating, we know the H-file is very dangerous, but what else helps this position? Well, I think here that the bishop on d3 is a very useful addition to this attack. It's pointing towards those pawns, and we're going to see it play a great part. We've seen this bishop be very useful before. And our pawn structure over here is very nice as well on g5 and e5. Another thing we should bear in mind is how much pressure under time are we to do something. So if we play something like bishop c2, which may look great if we can get our knight into d4, a lovely outpost, and then slowly just come round and do checkmate at our own leisure. There's not much black can really do to stop that one, or so it seems. Is there anything we need to be concerned about here? And we always must watch out for pawn breaks. And in this position, d4 is creating some great counterplay for black. He's opening up the center of the board, and the life is not so easy for us now. So we've got to be aware of our opponent's activity as well. So bishop c2 is a little bit slow. Now, you should have been looking for the most aggressive moves, and the move played in the game was rook takes h7. And this is the best way to continue, according to the author. Now, another tempting option was queen g4. But there is now a defensive mechanism that black can employ when you double up your pieces against the h-pawn with a pawn on g5. And it's actually a very common defensive mechanism that I've encountered myself on numerous occasions. And that's after pawn takes d3. And now you have a choice between moving the queen to one of these two squares. If you go queen h4, h5 is the defensive maneuver. And here you can try g4 to force things open, but black has enough time to go king g7 and rook h8, and black is defending. White's attack is beaten down, and you're losing as white. Similar thing goes if you try queen h3. h5 happens again, this defensive mechanism worth remembering, and if you take en passant, you've actually closed the position with your own pawn, and this is something we see quite a lot in sharp positions. This pawn black can use as a defender, especially if you can get the king somewhere like there, which he can do straight away. But again, d4 is another option here to create counterplay. And this pawn is a very useful defender for black. So we don't really have time to bring the queen in, so we must try to look for something active. And again, it's that time where you're getting to a critical position. If you don't find the right continuation here, you're going to be worse. So you must be brave and dive in. Now, the first thing to calculate when playing such a move is the acceptance of the sacrifice. So you should have worked out that if king takes, we now use the bishop by bringing our queen to h5 with check. And after king g8, otherwise we go queen h6, bishop takes g6 is the most forcing move. Again, you're looking for the checks, the captures, the moves that create the most scariest threats, checkmate. And after the capture on g6, we now have that standard theme where we just need to clear the first rank, and king e2 or castles kingside with rook h1 is crushing. So it's clear that black cannot take this rook. So what else can he do? Well, in the game he played c takes d3. And this got rid of that piece, but it was a very important tempo lost by black, and this led to the decisive attack for white. In actual fact, black now has to play in an equally aggressive manner and be willing to sacrifice something of his own. It's all about timing, and the only way to try and defend would have been with bishop takes g5, trying to get rid of this very dangerous pawn structure, which was like a clamp on black's position. And now there's a number of moves here which white can try. For example, taking on g5 is not so great, because after queen takes g5, black now has a bit of counterplay, and he's controlling some of these queenside squares. It's not working, so you need to play more aggressively as white, and the correct move is bishop takes g6, trying to damage the black pawns as much as possible. And white keeps an advantage here after pawn takes g6, otherwise the queen is coming in, and then just simply rook takes b7. So this again works out in white's favour, meaning the original sacrifice is sound. Let's go back to the game though. After pawn takes d3, what should white play? And again, this is one of those cases that we mentioned at the start. If you're trying to do a successful attack on a file towards your opponent, you often need to clear your first rank. Or, in this position, it's obvious you need to get one of your heavy pieces on the h file. So there's a couple of ways to try and do that, right? Which one is right? Queen g4 or king f2? They both have the idea of getting the queen over to the h file. Have a little pause and think, because one of them is actually not working well. Well, in this situation, king f2 is very important. You need to get this king off the back rank. By moving the queen, you wouldn't have done that, and you need to unite the rooks on h1 h1. And this opens up the h1 square, not just for the queen, but later for the rook as well. And the difference with this and queen g4, and again, you can find this move logically, is with this move, you've only got the chance of bringing the queen into the attack. With the other move, the rook has the opportunity as well. At the moment, it's blocked in. And after queen g4, you should have also been able to work out through calculation that if you try checking, now king g8, because otherwise you go in here, king f2, for example, with obviously a very devastating idea. But now black has this move we discussed in the last video, and a move that will often need to be played, creating an escape square. And even though it looks like these pawns stop that, because we sacrificed the rook, the move f6 actually leads to a defensible position for black here. I mean, if you try e6, we have pawn takes g5, and you can see this is getting very murky here. So this queen g4 is not working. The best move is king to f2, and now black is really in a bit of a helpless situation. Now, let's have a look again at what happens with the move. You should really, when you're trying to calculate this position, look at the most critical responses of your opponents first. So start with the critical things. Once you've worked that one out, move down to what you consider the less critical moves. And here, king takes h7 allows simply check and queen h6. And the major difference in this position is there's no time for f6 because simply queen takes g6 and rook h1. So our queen has got to a much more active square, and black is powerless to stop our simple attack. So black cannot take the rook. Now, what about here f6, as we saw before, trying to make an escape square? Well, this was actually tried in the game, but now just a simple queen to h1. And the main threat is actually queen h6 and just sneaking into g7. And there's not really much that can be done to stop queen h6. The problem is the f7 square is a key defensive square, and you can only, there's often in chess a problem. Many pieces want to use one square, and in this position the rook would like to use that square, but after the check the king can't, and there's that traffic jam. So watch out for those crowded square tactics as well. So very important, this king f2 was played first. I mean, bishop g5 was another idea where black trying to break out, but again queen h1 is pretty devastating. And here, after something like bishop f6, is a very nice move. Now can you see the winning idea? Queen h6, and because f6 is no longer available, black is in a position really of zugzwang on the king side. The bishop can't move, and white is very slowly bringing the rook over to h1, and then we have triple power, pretty devastating that, with rook h8 checkmate to follow. So a nice example there, I think, of this clearing the first rank in order to bring your pieces to the line that you need to attack on. One of the most important attacking positions when we're discussing using the rook or a queen on an open line, I'm pointing like that, like a shark, you want to do the shark attack, is the idea of having a rook behind a pawn and using that pawn to support a piece. For example, the setup you see in front of you here. And this usually occurs on the H file. Your rooks start on this area of the board, and black is most likely to castle kingside. So opening up the H file is a very natural avenue of attack. And you can tempt your opponent into capturing and opening up his file by supporting a piece with your H pawn. And this is something I've used very successfully myself. For example, here we have the right conditions. The pawn behind the rook is supporting a piece, and if that piece is taken, we will open up the rook with devastating effect. In many cases where this is used, I often use it in the Queen's Gambit, where I put, and I'm just talking about patterns. You should, like I mentioned, always talk about patterns. Think about patterns. Think about any opportunities, instances that I'm mentioning through this course that you might be able to relate to other positions. So have you seen this kind of pattern before, where there's a piece defended by a pawn? If it's taken, the rook is open up. The more you can relate to, the more likely you are to use them successfully in your own games. For example, immediately, let's think about one that I've had and won a lot of games from. I've had one where I put the pawn on d4, and you've got to imagine this, use your visualization. Queen on c2, and I have the same pattern here. So we can keep the knight, pawn, and rook, but if you can imagine, I don't have a pawn on e4, but my basic idea is to have the queen on this diagonal, which is obstructed, and then I have ideas of the queen diving into h7 with the knight supporting that, and if my knight is taken, the rook joins in. And often that will leave one defensive piece of my opponent's, the knight, which is stopping that plan, and I just have to get rid of that knight somehow. That's one basic example of what is demonstrated by Vladimir in this example. And here, white now plays c3, and black plays a beginner's mistake here, and he captures on g5. And this is just a very basic example of showing this attack on the open file and how we can try to arrange it by offering a piece. In some instances that piece might have to be taken, but it doesn't have to be here. So black is being very, should we say, a willing participant in this bad experiment. And this opens the black king up to various tactical possibilities. A better choice here would have been something restrained like a5. Just looking at white's last move, stopping some expansion. And now, if I was white, and the move that Vladimir suggests here as a good move is something like g4. Why not? And this is another very common attacking technique once you've gone h4 with a rook on h1 and knight on g5. Why is this a common idea? Because, and let's just bear in mind, we're talking about really cases where black has played h6. As we mentioned before, the move h6, which plagued Bobby Fischer in that old story I told you, is a weakness. It weakens black's king. By playing g4, you are in some positions aiming to get the knight out of the way, even viciously by taking on f7, and then by pushing forwards with g5, blasting your opponent's king open. And again, if I was in black shoes here, I'd be getting quite scared of that idea, so I'd be more tempted to take the knight. So it's just applying the pressure a little bit more here. And this is quite a scary position for black, but it's better than the game. Because after now h takes g5, white has done everything he wants to do. He's opened the h-file. Again, a word of warning, when you're going for these things, do calculate. You can't just dive into them and think, yeah, I'm following the art of the attack. Yeah, baby. Yeah, I'm the boss, man. I'm the boss. I'm the king of the attack. And then your opponent defends because you haven't calculated and beats you. And you throw the book away and you ask for a refund on this course. Everything is backed on calculation. This course is aimed at making you look in the right way. Now, what can black do here? And it's very tricky. I mean, black, the example given is taken here. If it goes to h7, then it seems to me there's a very strong move here. Can you see the strong move? And a typical idea. There's another couple of things very problematic about black's position. This bishop, a key attacker, and also the knight can play a part. And with a move such as g6, there's probably other strong moves. White is starting a deadly attack here. And my idea is very pretty. If pawn takes, we can go double check and checkmate. Oh yeah, baby. So in the game, this example, black took on d5. White keeps his bishop open. And now bishop e6, trying to get rid of that bishop. Now, had g6 been played, we can see here a very similar way to proceed with the attack as we saw in the last example. And white here wants to clear up his first rank so they can come around. The 90-degree attack here. So how can we do that? Well, with the very quiet move, King E2. The heavy pieces are getting ready. And if King G7, well, can you spot the idea? And you really should do if you saw the last video. It's white to play and win. And it's a very nice idea. And again, look for the most forcing moves. Pause if you need to. Rook to H7 check. Otherwise, black has time to defend. And again, this is where all of these ideas are based on timing. If your opponent has time to defend, you're going to be a piece down here. So you must have calculated this in advance. The idea is now our queen can swing around. Coming into G6. Threat is queen takes pawn. And after something like knight E7 defending that one, we can simply move our bishop. And there's no way now for black to stop the rook coming in with checkmate next move. So very, very straightforward attack. So bishop E6 played, and here we've got this other dilemma. How do we increase the power on the H file? And again, I suggest you pause or at least look at the position now. I'm going to keep talking now. I mean, King E2 is okay in some positions, but here we don't necessarily have the same technique because we don't have the H6 square. So do you want the queen in front of the rook or do you want it behind the rook? And in this particular case, the move F4 is correct with the just very straightforward approach of getting the queen in front of the rook. Now rook E8, black tries to make an escapes hold. G6 may be offered more resistance, but now we see another idea of this move F4, and the idea here is simply F5. And after something like bishop takes D5, F6. And this is a way to take the escape squares away from the black king. And after bishop E6, even though black is 2 pieces up, we can just play something with queen F3. And again, our queen is trying to find a way in front of the rook. And even though black has some tempo here, it makes absolutely no difference because there's no way black can defend. This pawn on F6, incredibly strong attacker as well. So after F4, rook E8, queen H5, king F8 forced, and now bishop takes E6. And this forces, shall we say, I mean, if you during tactics, if you can force your opponent to make a weakening move or a move where you gain a tempo, it's obviously worth considering. And the point of this is after rook takes, we have F5 gaining a tempo. And we're also using our pawns to start a successful or finish a successful attack here. If F takes E6 here, well now black is weakening this 7th rank, which we've discussed, and white can come in here with queen check, stopping the king coming to E7 because of mate, and after king to F7, G6 check. Always look for these forcing ideas. Tactical idea is queen H5, and now pawn takes E5 with a reinforcement coming in. Don't forget about the reinforcements when you're calculating. If you can't find anything with your active pieces, always look at ways to bring in your reinforcements. We've discussed before how bishops don't necessarily need to move off their first rank to play a very important part. You don't need to put them on like D2 where they don't really do anything unless it helps you get the rook in the game. And here's a case where the bishop can immediately fly in the game. And after rook takes E6, F5, rook E8, G6 was now a very clever move because we're trying to get rid of a defender of the 7th rank. So we can come into G7 with mate. King to E7, the only defensive try. And there's a couple of good moves here. F6 not being one of them, but the more forcing move, bishop G5, first check. And now, obviously after F6, you've got to look for the most aggressive way, and I'm sure you can work out here that bishop takes f6 leads to either the win of the queen or checkmate. And you guys can do some basic calculations yourself to check that. So we're sticking with the theme of this rook, pawn and piece. And in this case, it's the same pattern we saw on the last one. There are obviously some variants of this, but the general principle is you use your h-pawn in front of your rook, and you're trying to move your h-pawn away from the h-file to open up your rook. And you're doing this by generally offering a piece sacrifice. This was a game between Boden and Bird, 1869 this one. Nice old example. And here I have to say Bird did not play particularly brilliantly. It's white to move. White has a fantastic attacking position, a winning position anyway. This pawn on e6, again, we should always do a little bit of valuation, any position, even if we're jumping into the position. Actually, more important if we're jumping in. This pawn's a winner, lovely squares for the knight, and also the king on h8 is in a box, and the move knight to f4 goes towards that king. Might as well try to finish the game off quickly. And here black walks into a bit of a mess by capturing on g5. Now there is some argument to be said. I always had the philosophy that if you have a bad position, then you might as well grab some material. If your position is already really bad, you know, you're in a lot of trouble, just grab a pawn, even if it's really risky. Grab a piece, you know, even if you end up getting mated, it might work out, because at least it gives you some advantage. If your opponent doesn't mate you, have that extra material. I hate grabbing pawns and pieces, by the way, so I only do this in desperate scenarios. But in this situation, it's just too much. Black should have played something else, but the position is really, really horrible. I mean, a6 has been a line given by John Nunn with some idea of playing b5, but of course this is so slow. White can improve his pieces, bring that knight in, and after b5, the very clever move h5. And this is another example here of using the h-pawn, but rather than opening by capturing on g5, we're going to try to open by capturing on g6. And actually, this combined with a knight coming to g6 is again a pattern you need to be used to. And after something like h6, otherwise, you know, it's disaster. Check, king h7. This is just simply disgusting. White takes on e7, for example, and now you can bust through by taking on f6, and you get two pawns. But after queen f4, knight g8, they're pretty strong pawns. The queen is now threatening to come into g7. Game over. So black is lost anyway, but f takes g5 accelerates that, and hopefully now you can see the winning technique. And this is a very nice move, and again it's using that theme we just looked at. A typical method of clearing a file. So we're trying to clear the defense of black's king. Hopefully you don't need to pause too long. Knight g6 check. Has to be taken, and again I like this way of playing. There might have been other options, but let's try to go for the most aggressive move. H takes g5 check, knight h6 forced. Yes, we're a piece down, but look, our h-file is opening. We have the strong pawns and a queen attacking as well. Bishop g5, only chance, king b1, and now bishop takes h6, trying to keep the position closed. Had pawn takes h6 occurred here, then white can bring another piece into the attack with knight to e4. And now if the king steps out of the way, so the bishop is now sort of defended, we can actually break through in very stylish fashion here. It's one of those positions where, again, you should be looking for violence because you've got your pieces in the right squares. I mean, the pawns are nice, the knight is nice, the rook is nice. There should be something here. Those spider sense alarm bells should be going, come on, where is it? Where is it? Can you see it? Rook takes h6, violence, forcing your way through. You can't allow the queen to come in here, so king takes, and now knight takes g5. the knight is devastatingly coming in here. And if queen takes, well, we don't even win the queen, we checkmate. So, looks pretty good, doesn't it? So, bishop takes h6 was played. And now white just plays queen takes g6. The main threat is actually to take on h6 and then bring the other rook to h1. This technique we've seen. So black tries to get some defense with that by blockading with the rook. But now f6, and black is getting steamrolled out of the position. Queen e8, and now f7, queen f8, and here in we come. And now we see this last rook very casually coming in, and this is crushing. The game ended with the final piece coming in. Remember those reinforcements when you need them. And when it came in, black had had enough and resigned, as it's going to be mate extremely shortly. 1 or 2 moves. So again, very nice game there by Boden, demonstrating some of the key ideas. And this idea of leaving a piece that can be taken by the h-pawn, obviously calculation needed, and then trying to force an opening in your opponent's king's position. Mainly to do, in this case, getting rid of the only defender in front of the king, the h-pawn. Very nicely done. Another reason this works so well is that white has found a weakness because black's pawn on f7, remember pawn moves make weaknesses, has moved away. So g6 is another prime square that white's trying to move into. Make sure you keep an eye for weakened squares where you can base your attack around. Now we see a lovely example by the author of the book, not just a brilliant writer, but of course, in order for Vladimir Vukovich to write such a book, he has to be a brilliant player as well. And this is a game he played in 1925. It's nice to see his games included. He's playing Dr. Vajda, and he uses a lot of the themes we've seen already, but in this case, our main theme of somehow in this position, which looks maybe to the amateur eye impossible, getting that rook into the attack. Now, this is quite a interesting formation, and we can look at the pros of this position before we get going. I mean, white has some very strong things in his favour. Now, you can remember I talked about earlier on having a pawn on d4 and a queen on c2. So if we just highlight those two pieces, this is something I often get with the queen pointing towards h7. Now, I'm not lucky enough normally to get double power on that diagonal by having a bishop behind a queen. If you can get that, it's an incredibly strong attacking formation. You often get this formation, for example, in isolated pawn positions when you again can sort of work behind your d pawn, and you put the queen on c2 or on d3, and then later on the bishop on f1 sort of comes around this way. So it's a very good way to start an attack. But at the moment, black is defending okay. His knights are defending h7, and there's no obvious way through. Hopefully you can find the move that Vladimir played here. It's a move that we've been looking at the last couple of examples, and in such a position where you have these attacking sort of formation, you have a strong centre. Black doesn't really have any active counterplay anywhere. It will take him a couple of moves to get something going there. We should be looking not at positional play like bishop f4 and castle kingside. If you want to master the art of the attack, you've got to spot opportunities to attack, and here Harry 4, h4 is clearly the best move. People laughed at me when I played these kind of moves, but it's based on attacking principles. And the basic attacking principle, as we've seen, is trying to get your rook into the attack, bring in another attacker into the, let's say, the fight, the battle, and doing it by offering your piece and using your h-pawn. And again, some other sort of things we could say, categories in the position that make this possible, is black's pawns on h6. If the pawn wasn't on h6, it doesn't have quite as much use. But remember, with this pawn on h6, we can even think later on of g4, g5 in some situations. Again, this will force black to do something with his king side, opening it up. And the pawn on h4 supports that idea as well. And we're going to see even another option that was used in the game. Now, rook e8 is probably the best defensive move. Black wants to use the f8 square to try and defend, but it's very passive here. Taking on g5 is just what we want, because of course after pawn takes g5, this is what we're looking for. Giving up a piece to, you could even say artificially open the rook on h1, because it's your opponent who has to open it for you. You're not forcing it open, you're giving your opponent the possibility to hang himself. And black can only defend with something like g6 here, but after a capture on f6, we've got to look for new focal points to attack in this position. Can you see the main focal point here? Well, it's clearly g6. That's the one square blocking us, and that therefore we should be taking aim at that square. We could try rook h6, but the rook is doing a good job anyway on h1, so why not bring in another piece? And knight e5 is a much better way, because we keep our rook attacking and we're bringing in another unit to offer his life to bring us glory. So rook e8 played, and now white increased the pressure. There's no immediate breakthrough here, but knight e5 going forwards, just putting a little bit of now extra pressure on some squares, maybe c6, but now f7's weakened. This is really a target, especially with maybe the queen coming into g6. And here, bishop to b7. Obviously constantly refusing to accept the gift on g5, and often this is the best way. Your opponent's not going to be stupid and take that. And that's when you have to consider, is h4 going to improve my position, or am I just playing for cheap tricks? I mean, am I playing h4 in the hope it's going to be taken, or do I have some other reason to play it? In this position, it's 100% correct, because all of white's pieces are so well placed. Black is passive. Black doesn't have any counterplay, and we don't have to castle. If black had counterplay, then h4 may not be as strong, because we might have to leave the option of castling. You don't really want to castle with a pawn on h4. And we're going to see another plan that now comes into the fight here. One thing that black I can see is done wrong in this position, and this is again something I see a lot of lower rated players play, is at some point he's played the move c4. Now this, again, as the author points out, is a big mistake, because it dries up any counterplay black has in the center of the board, any opportunities black has of opening up the position. Black really needs to have the idea of capturing on d4 to at least try and get some of the protection away from the white king. Not possible here. Now we see the maneuver, which really is something new and beautiful. Rook to h3. Another strong idea behind the pawn move. And well, I say it's an idea we haven't seen. We've kind of seen the principle of the rook swinger, and this is aimed to bring the rook into the game as quickly as possible, and in this position on g3. Do not forget about this idea. In certain positions where you have a good attack, bringing the rook around is a very nice way of increasing the attack. Knight to f8 now played. Other moves are also not going to help. It will be the same reply, and that reply is now. Can you see it? I'll give you a chance. Pause now. There is a main idea behind the rook maneuvering here, and white is now in a position to force open black's king and to take it to the slaughter. And he can do that again by taking advantage of this little move in front of the king. It's amazing how many times these pawn moves can be weaknesses. Bishop takes h6. Crushing. This cannot be taken for obvious reasons, because now we see the point of the rook move, and knight f7 is even checkmate. So black tries knight to h5 to cover that square, but now queen to e2, finding another target, and here g6 defending, but now white, brilliant attacking play from the author, g4. Every move has this energy and purpose. Play with purpose. Knight g7, and now h5, and you can see the pawns coming into their own. Bishop f6, position is horrible. Pawn takes g6. Bishop takes e5, but It's game over now. White hasn't even had to sacrifice any material for this. And now there's a number of ways to win. White decided to play e4 here. Bishop g7, maybe even stronger and more, I would say more to the point. The purpose here would be, again, we want to try to get the queen over to h5. As we've seen, we've removed an important defender of the black king. And with g5, the queen is coming in devastating. But either way, white won very easily. So the author doesn't just write a good book, he plays a good game as well. So he does play what he preaches, which is nice to see. And we all love seeing a bit of H-pawn action, don't we? Oh yeah. It's always good to combine examples of ideas that we've learned already. And a whole chapter was dedicated to the classical Greek gift, sacrifice on h7. And I'm now going to show you a game given by the author, Steinitz versus Goldmayer, or Mayer, Goldmayer maybe, that was played in 1888. And this combines what we're looking at in this chapter, the h-pawn, trying to force open the h-file by normally trying to sacrifice a piece on g5, and the classical sacrifice on h7 against the opposing king. And this is, again, another strategy which sometimes works. I mean, we're all told that we should castle early in the game, but if our opening is going so well, or in an interesting way for us, we and our opponent's playing weakly, we can use the fact that we haven't castled to play this h4 advance, something I suppose I'm a bit of a specialist in, if anything. So Steinitz now faces the French defense, and I've already mentioned that the Greek gift classical sac is stronger in these kind of structures because white is particularly well positioned in this pawn structure in the middle of the board, because we have one of the conditions that makes it work, the pawn on e5, and we're very likely to have the other conditions as well. Now, this is the classical variation of the French, very trendy nowadays. I play this with the black side. I think it leads to exciting games. Hopefully I don't play it like Goldmayer does here. That'd be painful. f4, black needs to create counterplay in the French defense, and c5 is the one break that black basically has to play. You can't leave white's center being so strong in the middle of the board there. We need to clear it open. And here, a move which is rarely played. Pawn takes c5. But this kind of way of playing was much more popular going back to Nimzovich's days and the early days. The figuring here was that rather than try to hold on to your central structure, which top players play nowadays, you give that central structure away quickly, just so you release the tension and you can still put, well, I say still, but you can put all your efforts into maintaining your most frontal pawn, the pawn on e5. Bishop takes c5, logically developing. Knight to f3. Castles. I don't know if I'd be in a rush to castle as black there. I might try developing some queenside first. Bishop to d3. And now a standard mistake. And this really involves black not paying attention here. Knight to c6. Now, had I been black here, I mean, I'm just giving this because I understand it's a French, I know the French. I would be looking at this position and thinking, okay, well, you know, my opponent has taken on c5. Remember, if your opponent does something a little bit peculiar in a game of chess, there's probably a reason why it's not a good idea. And I'd be like, okay, so he's taken on c5, meaning he can't castle. His king, therefore, is stuck in the center at the moment. So surely, now that I have castled, I should be opening up the position. And the secondary pawn break you must play in the French defense is f6. And in this position, I feel that f6 is very logical. Just trying to blast open the middle so you can try to get play against the white king. And also, we are stopping a number of ideas involved with the knight coming here at the moment. Knight c6 is wrong, and now white played h4, which is not necessary. I'm not sure why Steinitz did not play the standard Greek gift. Probably because this book wasn't published. He obviously hadn't read The Art of Attack like you guys. He hadn't analysed the chapter like you guys. So he'd never seen this move before. And he didn't even know about it. Well, that's not true because he plays it very soon. But in this position, if we think about the conditions we talked about in the other chapter, it works very well. We have a pawn on e5. We have the standard knight, queen, bishop. Our bishop on c1 is still there. Okay, it's blocked by the pawn, but that pawn is interestingly supporting our knight anyway. Black doesn't have his pieces in the right squares. He doesn't have anything on e7, so maybe he can try running with the king there, but it's not easy with a pawn here. So clearly we should think about this move. And it works very well. The king can't go to g8, standard queen h5, and if it comes to g6, this is one case where we should actually play queen d3 here. Other moves still interesting, but in this position we can force it. If we can force it, we should. And after f5, we do the standard idea, queen g3. In these types of positions, you also have to be careful about grabbing that material. You know, if you start panicking and thinking, oh, I need to take some material back, it's normally a sign that something's going wrong. If you're going to go for these Greek gifts, you should be looking at either checkmating, not trying to average out the position through materials. And if you grab here, after queen a5, let's say you do grab the material, well, let's say you grab another pawn, so, you know, you've got your material back. Well, after bishop e6, you're clearly worse here. You haven't got any pieces to attack. Black's pieces are very good, and something's gone wrong. So don't grab material, but play the normal maneuver, queen g3. Remember, h3 is an idea if rook h8 is not possible, but this is very strong. And after something like queen to e8, now we can take on a6 with the idea that knight takes g7 is not grabbing material, but just wiping out the defenses. And I don't see any good way black can defend this position. So a missed opportunity there. Saying that, white played f5, and this is setting up the idea in a much more powerful way. And we can see the combination of these ideas brewing now. I have to admit, I've lost a couple of games in the French defence in precisely the same way we see here. And here, f6 was played, but it's a little bit late now. If we're going to play this, we should have played it before white has the opportunity to have this knight g5 idea. Maybe h6 was a better defensive try, because after f6, now knight g5 comes. Now, this is actually, I have to say, you know, not entirely sound, but it does demonstrate a very dangerous attack. With computer assessment, we can work out that Vukovic's evaluation was actually very optimistic. Remember, he's not working with computer, which I will show you. But it's certainly this, with h4, a theme that is really worth remembering. I mean, if you try to swap the order around and play it this way, black, of course, does not take on g5. That would be very willing. In this position, I'd imagine white is simply winning with the combination of queen h5 and g6. But black can play now. I'm just trying to work out his best defense. And I'm assuming here, can he play this? Well, this is actually quite interesting, this knight g5. Swapping the order around. It's quite hard for me to work this out immediately. Maybe you can try this move. Still very interesting, actually. Okay, well, let's have a look. Knight g5 was played first. And actually, okay, actually it does come to the same thing. Maybe black therefore did have to take g5. It comes to the same line I analysed before. My apologies. And that is, you can't let this knight sit, especially with the queen coming in, so you have to take it. And now bishop takes h7. Okay, so we got it. The combination of this move, giving the chance to open up the h-file, combined with the Greek gift. And I suppose, therefore, it makes no difference if you play knight g5 here or if you play it this way, because I think after this check, black will have to take. This move did look very dodgy for a number of reasons, maybe h5 being a main problem here. Knight takes e6. This looks horrible for black. So it doesn't actually matter the move order in this situation. And now, after king takes h7, there's not really any other defensive moves. We have this typical idea that this game demonstrates. H takes g5. We've given up 2 pieces, but our rook very powerful. The king has to go back. Now, I did say this looked decisive, but with modern analysis, I actually proved with some notes here that it's not decisive. What is white's main threat? Well, it's not actually to check because the king escapes. Remember that escape square syndrome. But what it is to play g6. g6 is the main threat here, stopping the black king escaping. Now, in the game played, black played knight on d takes e5. But in actual fact, there was a move and a way to defend with knight on c takes d5. And the point of this idea is that, like in the game, if we recapture here, the only difference is the knight's on d7, knight on c6. Black can now play queen c7 when the queen is trying to get to some very good square, and we're stopping this g6 move because g6, black can swap queens. So a little bit of bad analysis there, and this whole attack actually falls through now. It's the concept I really want to show you here, but you know, if Vladimir, the author of The Art of Attack, can analyze this wrong, we can as well, just showing how important it is to calculate. Now, if we compare that to the game, after knight on d takes, pawn takes e5, black tried rook f5. If black had tried the same idea, queen c7, this is now less effective. It's funny how this little swapping of the knights here makes so much difference, because white has the very clever rook, bishop f4, and after rook takes f4, check, king f7, and now g6 check. And black would rather this knight's on d7, because after king here, check here, this knight doesn't do anything to defend. That knight on d7 could come back to f8 in the other lines. So, for example, when a check comes in, there's a knight f8. In this line, white gets a very dangerous attack. Hence why black's knight is needed on d7. Very subtle stuff there. Now, rook f5 was tried. And now we've got to try to divert that rook away. So g4 from Steinitz. Rook takes e5 check, and now king d1. White's idea is just to get rid of that rook and continue with the onslaught. Also now, the f file is open, so we can consider at some point getting a rook to f1. Bishop e3, trying to stop bishop f4, seems quite logical. In actual fact, a very weird move here, and we can probably only see this after looking at the game continuation, would have been a6. In some crazy line, we're going to see that this is important to stop knight b5 with mate. But how on earth are you supposed to see that now? I don't know. Let's have a look at the game. It will become more clear. So bishop e3 looks logical, but now bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, and here it is, knight to b5. And this is going to be very important for stopping any king coming across to 2 potential escape squares. Rook to f3 was tried now to cover the f-file. Other lines are maybe even worse because white has the extra attacking avenue. Let's look at king f8. We can check. And we want to take on g7. You can see how this knight plays a very key role, stopping the king running. And if king f7, now we, of course, have this check. So this is why black played rook to f3. And now white gets the formation that he wants, g6. And this is often a decisive formation, the pawn on g6 against the opponent's pawn on g7 with some extra firepower. There's nothing black can do now. King f8, queen h8, and now queen g7, and the game is over because of rook h8. So certainly not a perfect game, like a lot of examples, to be fair, in this book, but it does show us that key idea of combining tactics and plans you're seeing, and you're going to have to do this in your own games. And here we're combining the Greek gift with the H-pawn and G5 attack. Can't think of a good name, so I sort of called it the H-pawn and G5 attack. Maybe not the best. But you have to use calculation, and even top players will not always be able to find the right way through it. So dangerous, these attacks to defend against. So if you're not a computer, I mean, how are you supposed to find a move such as A6, as we just demonstrated? I mean, you've got to be 2700 strength to do that, I feel. Now, it becomes quite clear during the course of this book that one of the author's favourite players is Alekhine. He uses many examples of Alekhine in glowing terms, and this is understandable because at the point he wrote this book, Alekhine had probably made the biggest influence on attacking chess out of everyone. This next game, another example of that. To take us to the end of the chapter, his opponent Esgrisson, probably of Iceland, I'm guessing, with a name like that, and very nice game here again, which we'll now take a look at to finish off this chapter. It starts with a French defence. Alekhine, a very principled player, so he plays one of the main variations, bringing the knight out. And now bishop g5 was Alekhine's preferred choice, and bishop e7. Now, there is also another line as well as bishop f6. Bishop f6 not considered to be that scary nowadays, that Alekhine invented, and that is the line e5, knight d7, h4, the Alekhine pawn sacrifice, and this very dangerous line even nowadays. Bishop f6 gives away that dark squared bishop immediately, but white is relying on just holding his center and playing in a way that he doesn't need his dark squared bishop. Black castles, and now bishop d3 pointing towards the king. And here black makes his first mistake. He plays the very bizarre rook e8. You don't need to play such a move yet. The break you always play in the French defense is c5. And c5 played here should actually give black a very decent game. He's trying to open up the position for his bishop, and if it's closed down at all, he will have pressure against d4. So this is absolutely fine for black, hence why taking on f6 is now considered to be a little bit, should we say, premature. After rook e8, white now plays e5 and prepares the sacrifice, the Greek gift, classical bishop sacrifice, with h4. And black does nothing to stop this, which I find quite strange. I mean, if your opponent plays a move like h4, alarm bells are ringing. Had black now played f5, this position is not so bad even here for black. White can try to keep the position open, but we can now see again the dark squared bishop gives black plenty of compensation. After the move c5, as in the game, well, of course, Alekhine dives in with bishop takes h7. And this requires very careful calculation and very high attacking play, because black has this extra counterplay in the center. But if it does work, if it looks dangerous, you should play it. And I think by doing some basic calculations, we can come to the conclusion such a move is going to be very dangerous for our opponent. And remember, if at any time at all we have a perpetual, that also encourages us to do this sacrifice. Black has to take the point behind h4, combination of these two moves, and now the king goes back to g8. In some respects, black would like to have the option of coming to h6 because Alekhine has given up his dark squared bishop. But the fact that black has played his rook away from f7 means that such an idea is just not working. King to g6 would also be hopeless in this structure, because the e5 pawn in these positions gives, as we've seen in many cases, we'll see, a very strong attacking position. In this case, we can also use our h-pawn by first playing check on d3. This allows our queen to come across, and after f5, just h5 check. And with our queen coming into g6 in most lines, or knight f7 winning the queen being played, black is lost. So the king has to go back. In we come, of course. And now black has no choice whatsoever. He's got to try and run with his king to the hills. He plays bishop takes g5, does the self-defense king with the king running. And black may have thought he was safe here. No. I mean, even in such positions, if white doesn't have anything too immediate, you've got to be very careful if white continues with such bad development with castles queenside. But of course, if white can open up the position more here, he should do. A simple capture on h8 and g7 is not working so well in this position, because black would have rook g8, for example, if we try this. Something like rook g8, and now you really take hold of this pawn on g5, stop it moving. So g6 is the correct way to play. We need to use that pawn now to open the position up more. Black keeps running with king to e7. What else can he play here? Well, if he takes on g6, we simply play queen takes g6, and we've stopped the black king running because of queen takes g7. So this has achieved a great deal. If black tries to start a counterattack with this move, white actually has two ways to win. Maybe the simplest is even to take on this square, take on f7. He could have also then attacked with queen h8 because we have the extra unit, the pawn on g6, for example. This way is different to before because of the threat of checkmate on f7. So black tries running, king to e7, and now pawn takes f7, rook to f8. And here, Alekhine picks actually the wrong move in the game. He thought the move played, castles queenside, leads a very exciting move, getting more pieces in the game on the d file leads to a winning attack. But in actual fact, there was a better idea in d takes c5. And this move had the benefits, if we compare it to the game, of not allowing black to gain any initiative in the center of the board. And white still has some crazy ideas involved with a knight taking on d5, and you can look in the notes to see how this would have panned out. After castles queenside, black plays far too passively by playing a6, and again, a common mistake. If you ever get an opportunity to try and get some counterplay, you should take that. And here black had the opportunity to take on d4, and this gives him an extra sort of tempo to achieve something in the center of the board. And again, the notes will show you why this doesn't quite work. So a small miscalculation on Alekhine's part, but after the move a6, things go back to normal. Now he takes on c5, a move he should have played before. And after knight d7, a beautiful move now. Very nice. Can you see it? We want to rip open the black king and do it in the most forcing way possible. Rook takes d5. Black tries to give his king an escape square. If he actually captures on d5, the king is drawn out into the open. And after knight f4 check, king e7, we always have a draw here, which is very nice. But the most precise winning idea is e6. Defending f7 and just threatening knight g6 at the right moment. For example, knight f6, well, this check here, black might be able to survive, so let's just guard the pawn. There's no way to stop knight g6. Those pawns are too strong. So queen a5 played, trying to give the king an escape square. We keep checking it, and this forces it back towards our pieces, and after rook h7, using another rank, queen g7 is very scary. Rook g8 forced, and we've got to find a way to bring all our pieces in the game. And here, rook d4, very nice, using another file to attack along. And only now, after queen takes c5, do we have rook takes d7. And the point of this move is the queen has come to a square where it's going to be attacked by the knight. And when our knight gets that square, it's flying in to d6 with tempo. Black has no checks. He has to move his queen. Knight d6, only one square for the king. And where is the beautiful finish? Hopefully you can see it. Really nice game of Alekhine. Really beautiful stuff. Queen to f6 check. And after it's taken, rook takes f7. It's a very exciting game there. It was a little bit of a shame that at that moment in the middle, Alekhine did not take on c5 first of all, which didn't make it a perfect game. But Black's passive a6 move allowed things to be okay for him in the end. And this is an example of using multiple files for the rooks to really create some deadly attacking chances and numerous attacking formations used in the execution of that game. Time to move on to some more attacking techniques to finish off this chapter. We've been looking at obviously the attacks on the open lines, concentrating mainly on the open H file, but open vertical lines in general. So these are going to be lines where rooks and queens do the damage. But also extremely important, and logically so, is the attack on the diagonal. And the diagonal, where the bishops and queen can work, have won numerous games in beautiful fashion. The most famous diagonal, and the diagonal that's claimed the most victims, is the A1 A8 diagonal, or the other way around, the H8 A1 diagonal. Hope I said that right. Because naturally, one side develops by fianchettoing, and when the bishop on either side gets that diagonal, it will often point to the opposing king immediately. So you've got that aim already at the opposing king. Now, you could also say sometimes on the G2 B7 diagonal, and also quite often other diagonals which are very important. Well, I said the most victims were on the A1 H8. It's also pointed out by Vladimir that the B1 H7 diagonal might actually also have a claim for that fame, because we've seen so many examples of this already. And naturally, when white develops, the bishop comes to D3, pointing towards Black's king if it castles over there. You can back this up with the queen coming in. Normally the queen will want to come in front of the bishop, and sometimes other uses of tactics, which we're going to go into a bit more detail, some standard things to bear in mind when you're going for these diagonal attacks. When I was studying this book in preparation for the videos I'm doing here, I thought some little interesting things I came across, and I want to share one of those with you now. And I didn't realize that the great player of old, Tartakova, thought that it was suitable to and this is a bit like what I do nowadays, suitable to basically give certain files, so we've just been looking at files, sort of names, or give them meaning. And he basically said the A file was the positional file, the C file the far-sighted file, the D file the Prozac file, the E file the dangerous file, as we've seen at the start of this whole course, F file tempting, G file sacrificial, and H file contentious. Oh, by the way, B file, why did I miss that out? Because I couldn't pronounce the word. That's why. So it was quite funny that even going back to the days of Tartakova, they started to name files. I name pawns. You give meaning to the board, it comes to life. Maybe this is a skill you should really look at. I mean, this is why I've called Harry Harry, because when you bring this pawn to life, you'll see the ideas more. But you can do this with files. You can even do it with diagonals. And the argument that is mentioned in The Art of Attack is, well, if Tartakova can do it with files, surely we should name diagonals. And he goes on to give some explanation of these in the book. But anyway, let's move on to some examples now of how diagonals can be extremely useful against the opponent's attacking king and what common themes you should really watch out for to help you build up some hopefully devastating attacks. Now, I'd love to know what should we call? Okay, what should we call the B1H7 diagonal? Let's just give it one name. Okay, well I know Fiona, who I stream with regularly, likes to call it the Fione attack when you put the queen and bishop there. But let's give it another name. Let's call it the sunrise attack because it's like a sun rising on the black king when the black king goes over there. The sunrise attack. You won't see that mentioned in the actual book, by the way. That's just me talking more normal rubbish there. But anyway, time to move on, I feel, yeah? Start with a famous example, one that I've actually seen, so it must be quite well known. I need to look at my classic games again. And this is 1945 and Toulouche versus Renter. And this is now combining a couple of ideas that you will see throughout this part of the course. And that is the idea of pinning and clearing. Now, it's white to play in this position, and we can see that white has this powerful bishop, not the sunrise diagonal, but the what are we going to call that? The I don't know. I'm tempted to call it the moonshine, but that just reminds me of some horrible alcohol that I once drunk and was very ill on. So I don't know. We'll call it the moonshine anyway. The moonshine diagonal. So you can see just how powerful this bishop is, but also combined with this knight on f5. It was Kasparov, but actually before him a quite unknown Spanish book that made the first observation that when you have a knight on f5 against a standard castled position, that knight on f5 is worth one pawn. It's worth one sacrificed pawn at least. And in this case, you have the extra pawn for black, but this knight can be a very dangerous attacking piece, especially when combined with other attackers. So the bishop and knight here, very nice. So how do we get through the position? How do we actually create some threats? Well, we need to pin and clear. And that's what the operation that Toulouche uses in this game. First of all, he captures on g7, and this draws out the opposing king into a deadly pin. It has to be captured, and the reason this pin works so successfully is that the bishop is very stable on b2 and there's no way to block that diagonal. Because of the pawn structure in the center, there's lots of open lines. Open positions, open lines lead to more tactics in general. There's no way black can get a pawn to block that bishop, and there's no way that black can exchange this bishop off. So it's kind of an eternal pin, and this is really aimed at clearing things out of the way. White now brings another piece into the attack, rook d1. This can be very useful because the rook might have ideas of increasing, bringing in reinforcements, because white doesn't have any immediate pieces in the attack, as in a lot of examples during this course. And also, if black's not careful, he might move away from the defense of g4, allowing our queen to dive in. For example, this would lead to immediate mate. And now black has a decision to make. Black plays queen to e7. And this is the mistake, a mistake that we just mentioned. A much better defensive move here would have been queen to f5. At least holding this square. I expect black did not play this because of g4 and even g5. And of course, white is going to be doing very well in such a position, but the white queen does not get into the attack here, so this was a better option for black. After queen e7, now the queen comes in, and after king to h8, well, there's a couple of ways of doing this. The pin is just far too strong. Rook d7 was played by Toulouche in the game, and in this way, white wins the enemy bishop. But there was an even stronger approach here, and the stronger approach would be to immediately increase the pressure on that diagonal, trying to clear it open. And you can do that by means of queen g5 forcing only one defensive idea, rook c6. And now you actually have f5. And this is quite a bizarre move, but we are slowly coming in with another piece into the attack, and this pin is just unstoppable. I can totally understand, though, why Tulash did not play this in the game, and to be honest, I would have probably gone for the line that was played in the game. The computer gives this as better for white, but this is a little bit unclear. You're a piece down here. If the other line is clearly better for white, then go for the other line. This is better, according to the computer and John Nunn, but in a practical sense, chess is a practical game. This is not the way I'd want to play. I mean, let's have a look. It is winning because black can't do anything, and black is probably going to even run out of moves. That's the other thing. So, he doesn't have anything he can do. Even John Nunn gives the line h4 here. But I don't know. I'm not so convinced this is a way that is a good way to win in a real game situation. The rook is trying to come round eventually. I don't think this. I mean, if I was in a game, I would just go rook d7 and think, right, I'm going to get my piece back. I've still got a deadly pin. Come on. I don't need to go for heroics. And I love heroics. I love giving up pieces. But not when when things can go wrong. Things can't go wrong in this line. I think this is much more practical. Queen e6 now played, and now queen g5, rook to c6, and now rook takes b7. This must be the correct way to play. It's equal on material, but white is clearly winning because there's no way that black is ever going to break this pin. White can play at his leisure any ideas he wants. Black is completely tied up. White just needs to keep on the knight. A very clear example of unstoppable winning deadly pin there, and this just shows us how certain diagonals can have a great influence on the game. And it's worth, in this case, remembering the combination of bishop and knight on f5. These two pieces can work very well to open up the moonlight diagonal. Another technique you will have to use in order to maximize your potential attacks with your bishop on a diagonal, again we're going to the moonlight diagonal, is getting rid of your own pieces or pawns in the way of that bishop. The last example saw white bashing through on g7 and clearing our opponent's pieces, but sometimes we need to get our own bits out of the way, and this is one case where the pawn on e5, as strong as it is and it can partake in the attack, somehow gets in the way. Now, having the pawn on e5, I would say is again one of the key components we see in a number of these attacks. And this was dating back to Alekhine, who mentioned that when you have a pawn on e5, you attack the opponent's king, something I want to bring up at multiple times. Now, funnily enough, this idea of clearing a pawn out of the way of the bishop is very similar to what we looked at with files. We're doing the same thing we did with files, but with diagonals. Can you remember when we went h4 with the rook on h1? And then we offered a sacrifice, normally by going knight g5, trying to clear off our h-pawn. So we're trying to move the h-pawn to the g line, therefore clearing up our key piece, which should be the rook on h1. Again, we're trying to, in those situations, get our pawns out of the way of our pieces. Other ways we did that with a file was bring the rook in front of it. But it's very hard to bring a bishop in front of your pawn. Not impossible. And in some situations, you can often see the bishop trying to get into f6. But in this case, it's not working. The game we're taking here is Alexander versus Sasbo, 1947. And it's white to play. Maybe you guys can find the right solution to this. What should white do? Again, pause if you need to. Well, if we quickly evaluate, white should have a very dangerous attack. Pawn on e5, bishop on b2, two knights ready to come into the position, queen ready to come in, rook on an open file. How many attacking pieces is that? It's a lot. I don't even need to count them to know that some attack here is likely to succeed. Black also has some pieces on the wrong side of the board, so I should be looking for some big blow. And knight to f6 is indeed that move. The knight dives in. We're trying to either get rid of this pawn or make that pawn work behind the bishop. Two similar ideas. A way that you could try to get the bishop working, not in this position, but a technique I've used, is to try to bring the knight the other way. So when it's captured, you open up the bishop in this kind of manner. This would be much stronger if you already had a queen on g3. And of course, with knight d6, you're not forcing black to capture that knight. Hence why the more forcing move, knight to f6, is more accurate. Because now if black refuses capturing it, with queen h4, white has an incredibly strong attack and a threat of taking on h7 with mate immediately. So black takes on this square, and now we move the black king to the desired diagonal. We capture on f6 with a major threat, so this has to be taken. And now we've done our goal of getting our pawn off that diagonal. Our opposing king is on that diagonal, and with the forward move, knight to e5, the threats become far too strong for black to deal with. There is a major threat or some point of the rook coming here, and black cannot move the rook to g8 because the knight comes in, and even though it's a piece down, there's nothing that can be done. White is attacking with 4 pieces. 3 pieces often enough, but 4 pieces against a very bare king. It must succeed. What can be done here? Well, bishop takes e5 was played in the game. The position is helpless anyway. If you play a move such as b5, there's not much else. What else can black do? The threat here, well, there's a number of ways we can do it here. The nicest way is actually queen to h4, increasing pressure on this bishop. And this is if you saw this in a game, you'd want to play it to create your own piece of art. The point being here, well, can you see it? What happens if bishop takes queen? We now fall into another pattern that's often played, which is knight f7, double check, and then knight to h6. Again, like the last example, knight and bishop creating some magic on the board there. Like doing the little tango on the chessboard. That's not really tango music, but you get my drift. But after bishop takes e5, black loses his last defender. Bishop takes e5 check, f6, and again, violence is the way. We can't allow black to play e5 and blockade our diagonal. We want to keep our strong bishop, so rook takes f6, and now the last piece comes in, rook to f1. There's no way black can stop this demolition on the f6 square, so black resigns. Black has had enough here. Well, as far as play on diagonals is concerned, the strength of the central squares that those diagonals are sort of aiming towards is particularly important. Those squares can assist the attacker in setting up outposts in the center of the board and in transferring pieces around those squares. Thus, one rule that you should really bear in mind when you're playing with bishops that are looking at central squares is to make sure those squares are well protected, your pawns in the center are protected as much as you can, and even overprotected, meaning you go a little bit over the top by, in this position, let's say, protecting them with everything you've got, kind of thing. And this is something important to positional play. And as we can see in this following position, black ignores those rules of overprotecting his central pawns, and he pays the price by falling into an attack against his king. This is actually quite a standard sort of structure we see here in the center of the board. Both sides playing just normal, sensible, developing moves to get a very symmetrical position. So no one has an advantage here. Stoltz versus Gumard. And the first move here, it may look like I'm sort of working against the rules I just said, but D takes C5 is giving up one of our pawns, but for a very good reason. You know, that pawn was over defended, it was doing a great job, but we need to open up the diagonal at some point, and it's okay giving one of them up if it's going to open up multiple lines, as long as we have some control in general. And in this position, we do have some control because our pawn on c4. And the most important decision black now has is what to take back with on c5. And he really should not, should we say, surrender the central squares here. And the d4 and e5 squares, these central squares are important to control. And this is what I mean by over-defending them. You don't need to over-defend them by placing pawns on those squares even. You just need to over-defend them by having your pieces pointing at them. And now b takes c5 would make a lot more sense, because your pawns are doing a much better job of controlling central squares. And in this particular case, controlling d4. After knight takes c5, black now loses control of this square, but also e5. Two important squares in the center of the board. White plays knight b5, queen to d8, and now just simply knight takes a7. But the issue was, if queen to b8, bishop e5, and you can see how white can use these central squares to his manner, and after queen a8, knight c7 would force the win of an exchange here. So knight takes a7 was played, and here it's true, maybe black thought that winning the pawn back on a2 would be fine, but the problem is he hasn't strengthened his positions, and white has clearly gained very good control of these two squares on the diagonal. So let's see. Rook a8, the knight slips back, and now queen to b1. We don't want that queen hanging around for too long. And after rook to a8, now a move I very much approve of, a move I've mentioned before, and a move which is working very well on our sunlight. Is it sunlight diagonal? I can't remember what I called it. Sunlight diagonal. I mean, look, we've now got this diagonal, the moonlight one, but we've also got the sunlight one as well. And the next move is something I use very often. Knight to g5. And this is even stronger in general, as we've seen when there's a rook on h1, because we can go h4, and there's no worries about black ever taking there because we open up the h file. But in this case, it makes a lot of sense because black does not have time really to play h6. He plays it in the game, but we have an immediate tactic getting rid of the key focal point of that defense, the knight, by using our diagonal. Black has lost all control, not just of the central squares, but also of his king side by this one very bad move. Now, g6 may have been a slightly better move here, but you can see how there's a lot of weaknesses now in black's position after this move. I mean, after h6, bishop takes f6, threatening checkmate, pawn takes, and now bishop e5 is a worse version. We have open files against the queen, very good knight, ideas of our pieces coming in. It's very horrible. The main threat here being bishop c7, simply picking up a pawn. Queen c8 was trying to get out of that threat and get out of this one. But now just queen b2, and again piling in on that diagonal. D takes c4 was played. If f6 was played, this would have been a better way to try and hold on to the position, but white can swap plans with bishop d6, and there's something a little bit ugly about black's kingside structure there. These pawn moves have made weaknesses. So d takes c4 was played, and now just simply bishop takes c4. We had to watch out for queen c6. Black's got his own diagonals. And now just f3. Very nice diagonals. Bishop a6 played, and now knight d4. And again, we're moving around these central squares here. Queen b7, bishop takes a6, and now hopefully you can see one of the points of this whole setup. It's like the first example we used, clearing off our opponent's pieces on the diagonals when we have sufficient backup, bishop takes g7. And the idea is to follow it up with our queen coming in, and after rook on f to a8, it's hopeless. White's won a good pawn, good enough at this level. But king takes also not going to work because our queen is diving in, and we have actually a very pleasant checkmate to play there. So the lesson to learn from this game is be very careful when you're giving away your central squares. You can give away your central squares by moving your pawns off them, but only if you keep your pieces guarding them. So we actually see in the first instant White giving away one of his pawns in the center, but it doesn't matter because his pieces are doing a great job. After knight takes c5, Black makes this one big mistake and he gives away control of 2 squares without getting anything in return. So something to bear in mind there with the central squares on the diagonals you're working on. The next example is now really about recognizing and finding the right diagonals for your bishops. It's easy when you have a bishop already placed on a strong diagonal that's going to be the area you'll want to move and attack on. But often you're going to have to clear up the diagonal which you think is appropriate by forcing measures, by positional or tactical means. And in this position, it's quite peculiar to see how White plays in a very strong manner. And this is Lundin versus Tartakova 1946. You might think the bishop here is purely kind of positional, heading towards Black's queen side and over defending d5. But the real strength of this bishop comes into play after White's next move. And in actual fact, by evaluating this position correctly, you should be able to see that the real diagonal for that bishop will be towards h7. Why is that? Well, first of all, let's look at White's pieces and then Black's pieces and structures to evaluate. White has strong passed pawn. White's pieces are very well positioned. The rooks for the opening of any structure in the middle on the king side. The queen is nicely centralized, guarding. Our knight has potential to jump around, jump up, and get down. And our bishop can hopefully create pressure against h7. But this really only works because Black has a pawn on f5. This means one of the bodyguards around Black's king has moved away and weakened the Black king. Had the pawn been back on f7, then any attack on this diagonal towards the Black king would have better chance to defend because Black has g6 and the pawn on f7 would defend that one. But now the light squares are weakened because that pawn has moved. We should also bear in mind that 2 of Black's main pieces, the knight and the rook, are over there, over on the wrong side of the board, meaning that we should now do something rather urgent before Black can bring them back to help defense. And all this leads up to the move e4 being the correct break. We can't, as Black, allow e5, so we must take this one. And now knight g5. We're trying to find a target, and the king is always the most juicy of targets, because if you win the king, it's checkmate. You can't win the king, but you get my drift. Checkmate ends the game. That's what we need to do. The rook comes in to take f1, and actually now, rather than going on the b1 h7 diagonal, there's another way that White can play because of this capture. Otherwise we would have gone for this one, but can you see another diagonal which is now very weak, again because of Black not having the pawn here. And this is very clever. This is again not just doing focal points, but this is really understanding the weaknesses in your opponent's position and moving your pieces to capitalize on them. And here bishop takes is actually a very nice idea, because the bishop, and I try to trick you at the start there, is better on this diagonal, the a2 g1 diagonal. I suppose that is the third diagonal which causes black the most pain, but maybe the most beautiful diagonal. We've talked about A1, H8, B1, H7, but this diagonal is really, I say, the most beautiful, because you often see the A2, G8 diagonal involved with smothered mate checkmates, which is personally my favourite. You know the one I mean, where you give up your queen on G8 and slip the knight into F7. So a very nice move anyway. Of course, we have to get rid of the D pawn, but this works well. Queen G6, and now we get rid of the D pawn. D6. The bishop is finding its feet. Rook F8, trying to cover F7. The bishop comes in nevertheless. King H8, and now Queen D5. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. For example, if black plays a completely ridiculous move, Queen H6 here, then I get my wish. Queen G8, Knight F7, smothered mate. I knew I'd get there eventually. Hence why I said this diagonal one of the most beautiful. But you can see how this maneuver of finding the weakness in black's position, looking where he's moved his pawns, looking where he's opened up areas of attack, has really allowed us to find the right squares for our pieces to move into. H6 was played, so the knight dives in. Black gives his king this escape square, but now a rerouting idea with the knight, a common way to keep the pressure. The real issue black has is these light square weaknesses, and he's a piece down effectively because the knight is offside. Queen E8, white comes in on the second diagonal, and now he starts doing a clear up job. Queen takes B7 and bishop F7, keeping the threats going. Always look for the threats. Queen D8, and now Queen F3, another threat, keeping the pressure on. And G4. We're happy with any ending if we're going to get one, but after bishop B1, there's not many squares that can go to. You're trying to rely on some dirty tactics, but just Queen D1. And that bishop, quite poetic. It's going to end with it leaving the diagonal, and as soon as it leaves this diagonal, we are going to pick it up and show our total domination on the light squares. So very important to look at the weaknesses in your opponent's position, try to maneuver all of your pieces to the squares to capitalize on them. And in this example here, Lundin did a very clever maneuver on weakening both of the light square diagonals where his bishop was going to be most effective. And he won a very smooth game by doing that in style. Now, we couldn't really talk about diagonals without mentioning the power of the two bishops working together. And two bishops in an open position can be devastating. I mean, I know, to be honest, I think people go on about it a little bit too much. Oh, the bishop pair, I've got the bishop pair. It's very hard to use the bishop pair, and you don't get it in many games. But if you can clear out all the pawns in the center of the board, then it can be a very good technique. And this is one such example shown from pretty standard position where black has given up his central pawns. We've said something about the dangers of that early on, but he's trying to really stay that white's pawns here are weak and are hanging, but that's not the case. And now white can play in this position and should play D5. The idea is to open up another diagonal. Black cannot accept the sacrifice, because if he does, after rook takes, we're clearing the way for another piece to come in, and you can see white's attacking units are building and building, and the simplest way to continue here is knight to G5. Making way for the queen. We don't need to do any heroics with the Greek gift. Simple is good. And after something like G6, we have actually now bishop takes G6. And this is using the other diagonal to come in on. For example, let's say F takes Queen D4, and you can see how devastating one of these diagonals becomes. So if black actually denies the sacrifice and plays a move such as Knight D7, we can take on E6, and here after some move like queen c2, the power of these bishops is really pretty awesome. Let's say bishop takes h3. Now we just simply take there and we're a pawn up. But had black tried to move one of these pawns, he makes more weaknesses. So g6 weakens the long diagonal, again demonstrating pawn moves around your king. You'd be very careful with queen c3. Bishop takes g6 was also strong. And if h6, can you see the right way to play this? Light square weaknesses. Every pawn move makes a weakness. In this case, it's g6. So we check and we try to get into g6 with knight to h4. And again, the devastating effect. So simple way of using two diagonals there. We often have to play a space clearance sacrifice to work on those diagonals. But in the original position, this d5 is a perfect example of that. We're now going to see an example of the diagonal in action to finish off this chapter on diagonals and files to help you spot them. A game between two quite big hitters, Geller and Kotov, in 1955, and in this game, white sacrifices a pawn to obtain control and very good chances on the long diagonal. And here in this Ruy Lopez position, white should probably even play d5, but he starts with b3. And we can see that white wants to get his bishop on this diagonal, and we've already noted some great tactical opportunities that can arise when that bishop has free reign of a diagonal. Bishop on a diagonal is much stronger when there's no opposing pawns on that diagonal, or the only opposing pawn is a kingside pawn. For example, if black had a pawn on e5 in this position, such an idea would lose some of its power. So bear that in mind when placing your bishops on diagonals. And again, we can see the two bishops here, a little bit like the last example. Another thing to note, the bishop on c2 also has a very useful diagonal, because the pawn in the way of it is under our control, meaning we always have an option to move this pawn as it's not blockaded, opening up that bishop. Knight b4 played, and white does not want to lose this potentially strong attacking piece, so he plays bishop b1, and now black takes on e4, this pawn that's been hanging there. But this move costs him not just the long diagonal, because we're going to see this becomes very weak, but a couple of tempo. And in such an open tactical position, you have to be careful. It might be all right, it might work okay, but you need to be very careful with your calculations. I mean, grab a pawn, play the most critical line if you can, but make sure you've calculated it very carefully. And let's see, bishop b2 now played, getting another diagonal, bishop b7, and white's point d5, opening both lines and gaining a tempo eventually, because this knight on e4 won't be able to remain there. Black plays very well, c4, again active play, trying to shut down one of the bishops with c3, or potentially blocking the other one with knight d3. White takes on c4, and now he decides, okay, this bishop is not going to get through, so I might as well get rid of the e4 knight and gain more time with knight g5. Looks scary for black. We have a combination of a lot of pieces coming in, but actually black can just about defend this position. It might have been a moment here for black to smelt that danger saying that and try to give back some material to wrestle the initiative off the opponent. I would say if you can ever re-sacrifice to get the initiative for yourself, I always do that if I can, out of principle, because I prefer having the initiative to not. And with this c-pawn and potentially some great squares, you can, as black now, rather than playing rook e7, which is a bit passive, it's okay, but I think a more active solution would have been rook takes e3 and now h6. And there's no immediate way that white can break through because black has this good defender. And black is going to take on d5 and use the c-pawn at some point. So I like this way of playing for black. Rook e7, a little bit too passive for my making, and of course queen h5 comes. Pawn to h6, and now knight to f5. Very dangerous. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, potentially 5 attacking pieces, but black has 1, 2, maybe 3 defensive pieces, and in this position black cracks first. Now, what options does black have? Well, he takes on e1 and takes on g5, which doesn't work well. He should have played rook on a to e8, but this is a really hard move to find. The idea there's no breakthrough and you're just trying to defend and start your own threats. And after something like knight takes e7, rook takes e7, black has really gains the advantage by re-sacrificing, but I don't know how many people would find that move. Being greedy can often lead to errors, and by black giving up a major defender, the rook, and then grabbing on g6, his position now crumbles. g5, I should have mentioned. Had he gone g6, what should white now play? It's a beautiful little combination. There's no surprise as a win with the open diagonal and so many pieces. Pause if you need to. Queen takes h6. Very, very nice. And this queen is coming into one of these two squares, and after it's taken, the beautiful checkmate is this one. Whew, that'd be nice to play, wouldn't it? So h takes g5 played, and now the last piece comes in, rook to e3. 4 pieces attacking. The rook is trying to come round, and there's no way that this can be defended. Black tries bishop c8 to get rid of the knight. Other moves. Let's have a look. Well, f6, holding up some diagonals, but now the queen sneaks into g6, and knight h6 and rook h3 is unstoppable. So that doesn't work. Black could also try something like g4, but again, this is temporary. And now that black has not blocked the diagonal, white can even force his way through with knight h6 check. And now queen takes g4 check. And in this case, the rook will be using the g3 square, the magic number of 3 attacking pieces. So bishop c8 was as good as try any. And can you now see the breakthrough? Obviously, we're trying to smash through the position in this case. And there may be more than one move. I mean, rook h3 looks logical, but maybe then f6 is surviving. Look for the checks. Look for the captures first. There is a way. Pause. Bishop g7. This threatens checkmate, so it's the biggest threat we can create. It is a capture. It opens up the black king. It has to be taken. And now that the bishop is getting in the way of the rook, rook comes into e8 check. And here it's checkmate in 2 moves with rook f8 and queen to h8 mate. Very impressive game there from Geller, a very famous game from Geller. And even though we could say the attack was not 100% sound, it was never really that worse for white. Unless, okay, black finds this very good defensive move. But it's a word of warning. In a position such as this, really Kotov should have realised that there's just too many pieces around his king, and he can't afford to give up a key defensive piece. And he should have looked at ways to bring more guys over to help his king get a bit of shelter. I have to say also, that brings us to the end of this chapter. So I was going to end there, but I thought a very fun chapter there with the classic bishop sacrifices and ideas of how we can use files and diagonals, do you like that, to start some brilliant attacking ideas. And I've certainly used some of these methods that I've seen here in my own games to win a number of spectacular games. And now it's your turn to go and practice them in your own games as well.